Welcome. My name is Myron Orfield, and I'm the director of the Law School's Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity and a professor of law here at the law school, and I'd like to welcome you to our summit today. We have to get started because we have a lot of content, but welcome to the Summit for Civil Rights. I look forward to your participation in the panels, and we're going to begin with a brief reflection from Reverend Mork, who is the president of the board of the Interfaith Worker Justice Institute.
Paul, you said I had 15 minutes, right? Again, my name is Doug Mork. I'm a pastor at Cross of Glory Lutheran in Brooklyn Center, and also the board president of Interfaith Worker Justice, which is an organization based in Chicago of worker centers and faith and labor groups around the country, really working on many of the same issues and in partnership with many folks who I think are here or will be here. 30 years ago, I was blessed. 30 years ago this summer, I was blessed to get sent south by my teacher and mentor, Paul Wellstone, to Knoxville, Tennessee, to work with a group of unions and churches that were trying to build a better world in Knoxville, in their little corner of the world. Over the next years, as an organizer for Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union, I learned from workers all over the Deep South. My turf was the southeastern 10 states, that we do this work most powerfully when we bring all of our values to the table. For many of these workers, they of course constructed their lives and their values from many places. A big one was often the faith community, and as they brought those values to the table, they were better prepared really to stand up in the fight for civil rights, to work together, and to build a better world. I just want to say thanks for what you're doing in all the different ways that you're coming to this work, all the ways you're bringing your values to the table, and ask that you'd permit me just to offer a brief opening prayer for our time together. God of justice and mercy, we know that you grieve with us for the deep brokenness of our world, the ways we are divided, the rhetoric of hate that too often prevails, the inequality that haunts so many lives. Inspire us to move beyond grief to organizing and action. On behalf of a world of greater justice, give us wisdom to move in new and powerful ways. Give us courage to act boldly. Fill us with vision for a world where all people in their work and their play, their neighborhoods and the public square, can experience your gifts together. Amen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bailey Metzger. I am the symposium editor for the Journal of Law and Inequality at the law school. I'm my third year here, and I'm happy to welcome you all this afternoon to the Summit for Civil Rights. We've been working hard for the past few months to put on this program for you all, and we hope that it's really beneficial for your work going forward. I just wanted to remind you all, if you have any questions throughout the next 2 days, please turn your attention to anybody who has a red name tag, and we should be able to help you. And to start off today, I would like to turn it over to the Dean of the Law School, Dean Gary Jenkins.
Good afternoon. Excellent. Welcome to the University of Minnesota Law School. We are thrilled that all of you are here for this terrifically important conference, the Summit for Civil Rights, that's jointly organized by Law and Inequality, a journal of theory and practice, and the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity. Law and Inequality, or JLI as we call it, is our second oldest law journal. It was created to fill a critical gap in the prevailing legal scholarship, really providing a forum for exploring how the law perpetuates systems of oppression, exploitation, and discrimination. And the journal is known for its excellence and scholarly impact. Indeed, it is consistently ranked among the leading specialty law journals in the field. And JLI's well-earned reputation continues because the student editors work tirelessly to further its mission. And in addition to organizing this fantastic conference and others like it, they publish 2 volumes and manage their own operations. And we are so proud of them and the students that run this journal. So I want to say thanks to all of you, and will you join me in giving all of the students a round of applause? Now, to put on a conference of this magnitude, JLI partnered with our Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity. The Institute investigates the ways that laws, policies, and practices affect development patterns in U.S. metropolitan regions. Specifically, the Institute focuses on the growing social and economic disparities, which are inextricably linked to the racial segregation that persists throughout the country. And in these intersections of the politics of race and class and the drive toward economic and social prosperity that are really at the core of the Summit for Civil Rights, this conference comes at a critical time for our country. I was looking at the calendar, and yesterday marked the 1-year anniversary of the most recent presidential election. And certainly the days and weeks and months that have followed that bitter campaign and the aftermath revealed so much to so many. And certainly many of the people in this room know that our country still feels the effects of individual and institutional racism, and that those effects seem to be emerging in very complicated ways, but also in some stark and simply ugly ways as well. Earlier this year, when we were at our new student orientation, I was standing right here, and it's always one of the great days for a law school dean is to welcome the new lawyers-to-be. But this fall, my remarks struck a different tone because I had to reflect on the violent demonstrations and the hateful rhetoric and the fatal attack in Charlottesville that had just occurred a few weeks prior to the start of the semester. And in that message, I spoke of the responsibility of the law school to firmly reject and condemn institutionalized hatred. But I also asked that we devote and recommit ourselves to advancing the values of inclusivity, mutual respect, and real justice for all peoples. And this summit, the Summit for Civil Rights, I think aims to do just that. In addition to convening leaders from the civil rights, academic, political, and governmental spheres, we're also bringing together leaders from faith communities, labor movements, and other advocacy groups. So by cultivating those kind of relationships among diverse cohorts and pooling our stories and experiences, I think we can really begin to leverage our collective power toward a movement to truly create economic and racial justice in America. Building this kind of purpose-driven collaboration certainly is not without precedent. Over the next 2 days, I'm sure we'll hear and we'll reflect on much of the history of the civil rights movement from the middle of the 20th century, a movement that was made possible by the collaboration of people like Dr. Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph and Thurgood Marshall and our own Walter Mondale, among others. But that reminds me of times when there were collaboration between the various spheres and sectors that we're bringing together today. And So I think our question is, how do we rebuild that broad national coalition united toward ending racial discrimination and segregation, especially in light of modern advances in technology, mobility, interconnectivity? How do we take advantage of all those things for a new century to increase connection and coordination? We are honored to host the Summit for Civil Rights at the University of Minnesota. I think it's a fitting site for this undertaking, given the law school's institutional commitment to advancing social justice. Even the namesake of the law school building, Vice President Walter Mondale, was the chief sponsor and really the driving force behind the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which prohibits discrimination in the buying, renting, and financing of housing. So I want to thank both Vice President Mondale, class of 56, and Congressman Keith Ellis, class of 90, for helping co-convene the conference and their leadership and highlighting the importance of this undertaking to the national civil rights movement. In addition to, we did thank the students, but I do want to call out two students in particular from JLI. The editor-in-chief is Alana Pulowski, and Bailey Metzger, who you just met, is the symposium editor. And June Carbone is a faculty member and their faculty advisor. So I want to thank them all for their hard work in putting together this conference. I want to thank Professor Myron Orfield, the director of the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity, for bringing us all together to participate and engage in this conference. And also, this conference has been made possible in part due to a very generous grant from the Kresge Foundation. So I also want to thank and acknowledge them. So my role is really just to get you warmed up, let the latecomers walk in, and I think I've done that. The door hasn't opened in a few minutes, so I'm going to sit down and let the important work of the day begin. Thank you all for coming, and have a great 2 days.
Thank you, Dean. I'm going to introduce my co-convener, my co-collaborator in this conference, Professor Will Jones. It's really his book that stimulated this conference. It really framed this conference. It was a book, The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and Its Forgotten History. It was a book about the discussion of how the labor movement and the civil rights movement and the faith-based movement worked effectively together to really change the country in the Second Reconstruction. And it made me think that we needed to see whether the lessons that Professor Jones talked about in his book remained true and whether they were important. Professor Jones is a professor of history at the University of Minnesota, and he's going to speak now and talk about this conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Myron, and thanks to all of you for traveling to be here. So I was asked to give you a sense of where this is coming from and what our hopes are, and something of a sort of overview of our agenda today. The idea for this conference came, I think, as Dean Jenkins mentioned, in the wake of last year's presidential election, where I think we all remember a feeling of widespread anger and frustration, distrust of political leadership and institutions, and really, I think, on all sides of the ideological spectrum, and something that I think in some ways also on all sides has sort of deepened over the past year. We saw outbursts of resistance and protest, the Black Lives Matter movement, women's marches. I would include perhaps earlier the Tea Party movement, expressing, I think, a similar sense of frustration. But these outbursts were often unsustained and rarely channeled into new policy and political power. Movements that were sort of spectacular in their eruption, but easily co-opted and often waylaid. They were also often fractured, divided over strategy and priorities. And I think particularly a theme that I think we will dwell on in the next 2 days, the way in which they were divided in particular over questions of race and class, in which the concerns of the white working class were pitted against those of black people, women, immigrants, queer and gender non-conforming people. Of course, these are false choices, right? The working class is not predominantly white nor male. White men share many of the same concerns as other working and middle class people. But I think we've not learned how to translate those frustrations into a unified political movement, one that can address economic concerns without sidelining issues of equality. And at a moment like this, I think there's no better choice, of course, as a historian of the civil rights movement, to look back at the history of the civil rights movement, a movement that was deeply rooted in links between economic justice and racial equality. We often forget that the slogan of the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, was for jobs and freedom. Central to that political movement were demands for integration and voting rights, but also to raise the minimum wage, to extend labor protections to all workers, to ensure that every worker had access to jobs that they were qualified for, regardless of their race, their gender, their religious affiliations, or their national background. One of the demands for the march was a massive federal program to train and place all unemployed workers, Negro and white, on meaningful and dignified jobs at decent wages. I think a demand that resonates deeply with us today, and one that I think we often forget was really at the center of what we now call the civil rights movement. So we want to explore this legacy today and ask, how can we build on it? What kinds of lessons can we take? We don't want to just reconnect these themes, but also to understand why so many of our leaders, particularly liberals and progressives, seem incapable of, or perhaps unwilling, to bring these powerful themes and constituencies under one program for racial justice and economic opportunity, the way the leaders of the civil rights movement did so 60 years ago. I think particularly puzzling is the lack of attention to racial segregation, which is arguably one of the most visible and obvious examples of what many call institutional racism, but is rarely addressed directly. We hear much about racial disparities in arrests and sentencing, educational attainment, wealth, and income. But how is it that we seem to have lost sight of the actual question of and the phenomenon of segregation, a structure and a condition that, if not the cause of, helps to fuel, perpetuate, and reinforce so many of our other national problems? Now, some of the current tensions and debates that we're confronting now were not unknown to our civil rights forebears. But at some point, they seem to gain clarity about the interconnectedness of segregation in the workplace, in housing, in labor unions, in schools, and in public accommodations. And making those connections is what allowed them to build an alliance of faith leaders, labor leaders, civil rights leaders, and litigators that was powerful enough to break the back of Jim Crow in this country, at least as we knew it then. So we decided that we wanted to have a conversation that could explore these questions. We want to start with laying out the facts of segregation today, the impact it is having on our society, and the causes and structures of it. Tomorrow, we're going to examine the history of the civil rights movement to see what lessons we can draw on it. We're going to take what we learned and issue a challenge to ourselves to act. We will all be invited to participate in getting ourselves organized and ready for action. We'll have 3 breakout groups, one on litigation, one on legislation, one on organizing, that will meet to begin to plan meaningful and coordinated action coming out of the conference itself. Many of the most important decisions and powerful actions and organizations of the civil rights era started in a conference, including the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which actually was founded at a literal conference. It's our hope and a goal of this conference that it leads to a stronger, broader coalition and leads to more organizing, more agitation, and more action, and not just more conferences. So with that said, I'll turn the floor back over to Myron, who's going to introduce our morning speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Well, it's my great privilege to introduce to the audience today the chair of the United States Civil Rights Commission, Catherine Lamon. Catherine Lamon was appointed by President Obama for a 6-year term on December 15, 2016, with the hopes that the Civil Rights Commission would return to its historic role of pushing the country forward on issues of race and inequality. Before that, she was chair of the Civil Rights Commission. She served as the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, and before that, she worked in the public as the Director of Impact Litigation at Public Counsel, the nation's largest pro bono law firm. She received her JD from Yale Law School, where she was the Outstanding Women Law graduate, and she graduated summa cum laude from Amherst College. It's my pleasure to present Chair Catherine Lamon.
Thank you, Myron, and thank you all for being here today. It's really a pleasure to be in a room full of people who are so committed to what I do every day, so thank you for that. It's inspiring, it's really terrific to be with you as you begin thinking about how to sustain and nurture a truly diverse, fantastic coalition that is focused on actual delivery of civil rights for the country. So I wish you luck, and I thank you for the task that you've begun, and I look forward to what will come from these 2 days together. As I mentioned, I live your task every day, chairing the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, so it's comforting to be with you all. The reality is that we need that comfort because our task, your task for these 2 days, and I hope every day going forward, is urgent by any measure now. The data that has been reported recently confirming what many of us know and live anecdotally, that there's been an increase in spates of hate incidents from 2015 to 2016, in a particular spike around the election, is a confirmation of how urgent this work is. So is the ongoing segregation in housing opportunity in the country, the radical resegregation of our schools themselves, the material differences that we document in the civil rights data collection, in the opportunities actually delivered to students in schools, regardless of how segregated they are or are not, in the longstanding data and increasing public attention to different police interactions with communities of color than with white communities, and our polarizing politics today. We know that the work that you've come together to discuss is urgent. It's also especially urgent now because we live in a time when our federal civil rights officials are at best, me excluded, but at best indifferent to civil rights and often hostile to civil rights. And so I want to concretize how dangerous that time is now for us, walking through some lowlights in this administration. The Attorney General, the Chief, I'm going to get to the Attorney General because I have special disapprobation for his views, but the Chief in the Health and Human Services Agency with respect to civil rights, only prior relationship to health-related civil rights was to oppose application of Obamacare to transgender Americans. Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson has characterized himself as unqualified for the job, which I will say is a view I share. He's characterized poverty as, quote, a state of mind. And during his listening tour, as he began his time as the HUD Secretary, he said that he doesn't believe that low-income residents should be comfortable, because a comfortable setting, this is a quote, would make somebody want to say, I'll just stay here. They will take care of me. And he specifically cited the bareness of an overnight housing shelter that has bunk beds grouped in a room as a positive example of what kind of low-income housing the government should be offering to persons who need help. So turning to the Attorney General, so I gave you a preview of my views, but the Attorney General has decided that it's a good idea to cite ICE officials in courthouses, to discourage people's access to justice, to discourage people from coming forward as witnesses, much less to seek justice for themselves in our American justice system, has directed his staff to reconsider all existing consent decrees and also contemplated proposed consent decrees with respect to systemic police reform, because we shouldn't let the actions of a few bad actors drive systemic change, notwithstanding a 23-year mandate from Congress that the Department of Justice do exactly that the Department of Justice exactly look at the ways that some police departments engage in systemic violations of the constitutional rights of American citizens in their policing work. And so the message from the Attorney General is that we will turn our backs on our communities and that we will not have a strong enforcement message for civil rights in our communities moving forward. And then my former department, the Department of Education, is starving the budgets of the Civil Rights Office as well as the full Department of Education, withdrawing critical guidance related to sexual violence, related to transgender students, and we expect more to come, directing staff to under-evaluate rights, and consistently failing to commit to enforcement. Those policies, those practices across the federal government come directly from our president as well. The President of the United States himself tweeted, and we're talking about tweets with this president, but tweeted this week that United States Senator Elizabeth Warren, he called her Pocahontas in a derogatory reference to his disbelief about her Native American heritage. That's the President of the United States and the rhetoric that he shares with our full community. So we are living in a time when the clearest, most consistent signals from our federal government are a retreat from civil rights. And that says to us that we need to come together. We can't rely only on the federal government. We can't rely on someone else to ensure the rights that have been part of a 60-year national consensus about who we are as a community and what we expect to live and what we expect to provide to all of the people who are part of our fabric. And the reality is that I am sick every day about how hard this time is. And I think we are past time to realize that we need to be vigilant at all times. We can never rest on our civil rights laurels. We cannot assume that a gain is a past tense gain that we can live and rely on moving forward. In fact, Thomas Jefferson is famous for having said that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, and that was remarkably prescient, that phrase, that we need to be eternally vigilant. We cannot assume that we have achieved civil rights and that we can turn to a next task. We have to nurture those rights every day. So I'm grateful that you are planning to do it. We know that the story of our nation is a story of constant struggle between our promised ideals and what we live, and the impulse to discriminate, which we know is very strong. The reality is also that the story of our nation is a story of people who are willing to fight for what they know to be right, to stand for what they know to be right, and to stand for other people. And you all coming together these 2 days demonstrate that you are those people. So thank you for being those people. I rely on you, and I want you to know that my fellow commissioners at the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights take our charge seriously, and we will seriously rely on you, and we will also fulfill our duty to you. The Congress 60 years ago now created the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights as a federal independent commission that is to advise Congress, the President, and the public about efficacy of federal civil rights policy, efficacy of federal civil rights enforcement, and the need for improved or changed federal civil rights policy. And over the 60 years that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights has been in existence, the Commission has influenced all of the federal civil rights laws that have passed in that time. That's on the one hand, a really terrific record, and on the other hand, I think that there's much that we need to be saying today. The kinds of ways that the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights has sustained our civil rights traditions in this community have ranged from shoring up the basis for the 1965 Voting Rights Act, calling for the creation of the act, and then also creating data that supported the United States Supreme Court's decision to affirm the constitutionality of the act when that was challenged. Even before that time, the Commission called for the use of fund withholding from the federal government as a way of enforcing federal civil rights principles. And so actually called for the creation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, among others, but then said, once we say that we as a country don't allow federal dollars to be used to discriminate on the basis of race, among other categories, the way that we will enforce it is that there will be federal civil rights officials who will withhold federal funds from those institutions that fail to live up to the promise in the congressional mandate. It's an incredibly meaningful stick to carry in the federal government. It's an incredible enforcement tool. I was very pleased to be able to wield it when I was Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the Department of Education. I also strongly believe in what the Commission did for us as a country all those years ago to say we should have that tool and we should expect it to be used. So that leaves us to where are we now and what will we do now? The Commission is bipartisan by design, and the goal is to be able to bring people from lots of viewpoints together to think about what are the right messages for the country. We as a bipartisan commission have voted unanimously to conduct a 2-year investigation of all of the Trump administration's civil rights enforcement policies. And so that's actually to do oversight of what this administration is going to be doing. Thank you for the applause. I'm really thrilled to be able to do it. I think it's obviously critically important that we do it. The oversight will only be as meaningful as the information that we can take in. So we will rely on you. We will rely on your friends. We will rely on all around the country who are willing to share views about how this government is and is not enforcing civil rights and what more should and should not be done. So that's one of our projects, but we have more. So we also have upcoming reports that will come out in the coming weeks related to LGBT employment in this country, and also related to school finance equity and resource equity in our schools around the country. We have briefings coming up. We're going to hold a briefing about voting rights. It's timely, given the anniversary that was yesterday in this country. We're holding a briefing about voting rights in the country, holding a briefing about the school-to-prison pipeline focused on students of color with disabilities, and we're holding a briefing focused specifically on hate incidents, which is what I started this talk about. So we have a pretty broad-ranging agenda of kinds of topics that we expect to speak to. And as I mentioned, we rely on people sharing with us what their concerns are, sharing with us what their recommendations are, sharing with us what their experiences are of civil rights satisfaction and civil rights dissatisfaction in the country. So I invite you to come to the Commission briefings, to share information with us, to allow us to be your eyes and ears, to then be able to make recommendations about what civil rights will be. We also watch carefully what comes from convenings like this one, about what recommendations are, what needs are, what should be examined, what should be done in the country. So I'm looking forward to being in partnership with you in addition to speaking to you now about what it is that you will say. And I have just a few minutes before I have to race to catch a flight, but I want to end with saying that as bleak as these times are, as hard as these times are, as challenging as they are, we know that there is value in speaking up. We know that good comes from saying what you know should be right, making a plan for how to get there and how to deliver that for many, many more people in addition to those in your immediate nucleus. And we know that even though I've said that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, even though we also know that it's hard to ensure that those promises are the lived reality around us. We know that when we stand for other people, that there are ripple effects that follow from it, and that we can't always quantify how many people benefit from the good that we've done. But we also know that if we're not looking, it will be worse. And so I want to tell you just one example of an investigation from when I was at the Department of Education that is recent, to say how far we've come, how far yet we have to go. This was an investigation of an Alabama school district that had achieved unitary status, which means that it had convinced a court that it no longer segregated its students, and that it offered equal opportunity to all students. And this was a school district that had been part of litigation begun in the 1960s about racially segregated schools, had gotten to a time when it had achieved unitary status, and then when we were investigating this district, we closed our resolution investigation of the district in 2013. When we were investigating the district, this district had 23% black students, but one of its 4 high schools in the district was more than 90% black students. So it already begs the question about whether they actually had achieved unitary status for real for their students. But we learned that the one high school that was more than 90% black students in this district that had promised Accord that it no longer offered segregated education, in that high school, they never offered a single advanced placement course. Not only were they not offering advanced placement courses, they didn't offer international baccalaureate, they just weren't offering high rigor course to the students in this one high school. They were in the other 3 high schools. They had advanced placement microeconomics, the full range of advanced placement courses, and the black students in the other 3 high schools were taking those courses and succeeding in them. But in this one high school, the 93% black high school, they didn't offer the courses. And we asked the principal why he wasn't offering those courses in this integrated school district that was delivering equal opportunity to all students. He said, well, these students need remedial education. All of them? That's the leadership in the school for these students, that not one student in that high school was college bound, not one student was ready for high rigor courses. You'll be happy to know that that principal's not the principal anymore. and better. The district has agreed to offer high rigor courses to the students in that high school, just like in all the others, but it's also agreed to go back to kindergarten to figure out what it takes to develop a pipeline so that students are ready to succeed in those courses when they get to them, that the students understand that those courses are for them, and that their instructors throughout elementary, middle, and high school understand that those courses are for them, and that the students need to be prepared, and that the school needs to communicate a welcoming environment. I say that to you to say, that was 2013 when we had to enter into that resolution agreement in a district that had had a history of de jure, formal racial segregation, that had gotten itself out from that history, but that still perpetuated that history, and that wasn't making a change absent a federal requirement and ongoing federal oversight to make sure that they live it. That is to say that standing for somebody else matters. It's not enough just to have a principle. It's not enough just to have an agreement about who we're going to be and what we're going to do. You have to monitor it. You have to be there. And you have to say when somebody says, these kids don't count, this community doesn't matter, that this part of America is not as important as another, that is wrong, that is not who we are, and that we don't accept it. So that we are a community that comes together, that responds, and that creates who we want to be. I see that at this law school. It was fun for me to walk in and see, going in the bathroom, big signs for where the gender-neutral bathroom is in the building, and to see big signs for how to get to the accessible bathrooms. This is a community I see when I was waiting to speak. I saw a beautifully multiracial group of students coming in and out of the lounge, waiting to come in now to this conference. And so I see that this is a place that is inclusive, that lives its values, and that is prepared to be the community that it should be for schools. We need that in all of our institutions. We need that not just here, we need that everywhere in this country. And so I really welcome your coming together to think about how we build that, how we sustain it, and how we together nurture it and are the community that will make that happen. So thank you for letting me start your time, and I look forward to what will come from this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be in the second panel, which is called the Scourge of Segregation, just with a short opening discussion. But hardly anyone ever talks about segregation anymore. We know, and researchers have shown, how poverty destroys and segregation destroys the lives, particularly of young people. How segregation deprives children of opportunity, degrades their health, and destroys the fabric of urban life and the fiscal basis of cities. It divides our democracy and distorts our political discourse. Each year, each month, each day, this becomes clear, unmistakably clear, yet is unspoken. yet it is invisible. But it is anything but invisible. It is not part of the public conversation or the political debate. Our society talks a lot about the effects of segregation, like failing cities and schools, the achievement gap, the wealth gap, the job gap, the incarceration gap, and crime. But almost no one talks about racial segregation, a root cause of all of these inequalities. If we acknowledge the existence of segregation at all, we talk about it today often as a phenomenon of the choices in a post-racial society. We pretend this neo-segregation we now experience is because of individual racial preferences, and that people like to live like this, that they like to live with their own kind, that the preferences of the different races are incompatible, so racial integration is inevitably impossible. We assume that the problems in neighborhoods exist because there are problems with people, the problems with the neighborhood, rather than contextualizing urban problems within the pattern of discrimination and segregation. Yet this preponderant view of segregation is false. Segregation for non-white Americans, it's not about choice fundamentally. It's about illegal, unacknowledged, and clearly improper discrimination. When a black household that earns $167,000 a year is less likely to qualify for a prime rate interest loan than a white household that earns $40,000 a year, that is not a choice. That is discrimination. When the government produces statistics and publishes them and does nothing about them, that is state action. When middle-class black families seeking housing as testers are systematically shown different neighborhoods than whites of similar income, education, and credit history, when they are steered away from each other, that is discrimination. That is illegal discrimination. And this is a pattern that has been growing in our society, not shrinking. When the government systematically builds low-income housing in the poorest and most segregated neighborhoods, even when there are applications in whiter neighborhoods, that is discrimination and segregation. We all know that this has been happening for decades and nothing has been done about it. Perhaps this is because there is some mental eyelid that must remain shut and we can't discuss this. We're too afraid of the controversy. We're too afraid of the backlash. We're too afraid of what might happen. We're too afraid that the very discussion of this profound inequality is unpalatable. Yet silence in the face of this discrimination only allows it to continue and creates a lack of understanding among the general public about the growing separation of the races. We live in a society that is more and more different, that it is more and more separate. Wealthy and the most affluent whites live very far distant in communities, and they mainly see people of other races through the television news, which is often unrepresentative history and litany of crime and disorder. If there is evil in this country, it lives in the forces of segregation. This is an evil that destroys people's lives and causes people to hate themselves. Segregation destroys the mightiest manifestations of our popular democracy, America's great melting pot industrial cities that are now dying and sinking into bankruptcy throughout the Midwest and Northeast. It erodes the possibility to build progressive coalitions that can help us achieve humanity's better purposes. It prevents us from acting to stem economic, moral, and environmental problems that could but need not cause deep harm to our society. We stand today in a new century. In the decades following the emergence of the civil rights movements, the inequalities of race have not been fundamentally addressed in our society. Meanwhile, the multiracial civil rights movement of racial justice, labor, and the faith-based community has fallen apart. It has fallen apart because we have forgotten or failed to understand our interconnectedness and self-interest, because we have abandoned and retreated from the moral cause of America, and because we have been sold a bill of goods by pirates and profiteers of segregation. For a generation or more, a group of professional policy entrepreneurs who would be subject to regulation in any other field have told the country that there are very simple solutions to the problems of a deeply divided society. As they come and go, they are rewarded with literally billions of dollars of federal and state and philanthropic money to avoid the very issue of segregation and to think about every other part of the process that may be creating inequality. It's too hard to deal with segregation. We have a group of, the idea of private charter schools has been put forward to the solution. It's a solution to the problems of poor, profoundly segregated schools. But these schools are not only far more segregated than the public schools themselves, but more dysfunctional in most respects. They are growing into an industry whose business plan, and at the heart of its business plan, is the preservation of segregation. We are building hundreds and thousands of units of housing at great expense in poor segregated neighborhoods, treating this as a solution to the problem of inequality, at the same time only intensifying this problem. We know that segregation depresses opportunity of individuals. We know that it prevents children from graduating from high school. We know that the average child of color is in a school that's many times as socioeconomically poor as the average white child. We know that these high schools are as powerful in their reputation in getting into college or not getting into college as their grades and test scores. We know that these are very serious problems. We know that children in these overwhelmingly poor schools that are isolated, that are cut off from the broader economy, from colleges, are severely disadvantaged. We also know that whites and African Americans who live apart from each other and have restricted opportunities to know one another have shared interests that they cannot discuss, are unable to communicate. We are unable to understand each other's aspirations and our hearts and minds in a way that our fellow citizens need to in a democracy. We cannot continue to allow ourselves to grow into separate racial and social societies where one side is held down and profound harm is done to those who are held apart. In the end, we all lose from this. Segregation is a hard question, one for many years that has been unaddressable. In the early part of our nation's history, the very mention of slavery was forbidden in the U.S. House of Representatives. They weren't even allowed to discuss this. It was too controversial. It was too divisive. The very discussion of this issue would create such problems that the country would be unable to function. Yet religious and faith-based leaders, men like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, did raise these moral issues. They did speak out. William Wilberforce and the great black leaders in England subsequently raised these issues as moral issues. They stood witness at a time when it was impossible to discuss these issues, and their transformative witness changed the debate. When Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist preacher, raised the issue of slavery, he was murdered, and his press was thrown into the river. William Lloyd Garrison narrowly escaped death many times. Martin Luther King ultimately paid the most major price for his discussion. Yet the experience of all of these leaders, of King, of Frederick Douglass, of William Lloyd Garrison, was transformative, and it changed people's hearts and minds. Both during slavery and the civil rights movement, raising this moral issue, bringing facts to bear on this situation, exposing injustices and inhumanity again and again, brought these issues to the forefront of the country. And it is time again to reach across the bounds of race and to build a multiracial society and a multiracial movement for justice. Just as slavery was wrong, so is discriminatory segregation, so is housing segregation. And because of America's great divide, and because of the enduring scourge of segregation, we are all less capable of resisting and countering the forces of reaction that grow in our society with each passing election. We all know that we have to work on these issues together, that each time and each moment our society, when a group of individuals that was previously excluded gains access, when they become full members of the society, that energy and creativity builds in the society. New ideas, new culture, new art, new music, new forms of civilization are created. Imagine what might happen in this country if the energies of all the people were made available to change this country. Imagine if all of our energies in our society were geared toward improving our common purpose Imagine a society where cities are strong, where the older suburbs renew themselves, where open spaces at the edge of our metropolitan areas are not torn apart because they are needed to build a new group of suburbs where one group of people can escape for another. Imagine a way that we could work together. Imagine all the time that we have used to spend to divide ourselves. Imagine how that could be rededicated toward building a new society. Then things could really change. I'm going to call up to this panel Algernon Austin, who's going to moderate. Algernon Austin is an economist at Demos, which is a public policy organization. He's previously been a professor at Wesleyan University, and he wrote a very prophetic book that I hope you'll think about purchasing. I think it's at the table outside. His book is America is Not Post-Racial, Xenophobia, Islamophobia, and Racism in the country. So he'll be moderating this panel on the Scourge of Segregation.
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yeah. All right, great. Thank you very much for that introduction, Professor Orfield. I am not going to go into too much detail for the bios of our panelists. You can read the bios on the back of the little pamphlet for the conference, but I will say that on your right, to the far right, your far right is Alexander Polakov, co-director of Public Housing and Senior Staff Council for Business and Professional People for the Public Interest. And next we have Lisa Rice, who is Executive Vice President of the National Fair Housing Alliance. And next to her, we have Paul Jargowski, who's the Director of the Center for Urban Research and Urban Education at Rutgers University. So we have an excellent panel of experts here. And our charge is to really lay the groundwork for some of the later discussion and work at the end of the conference, which I'm very excited about, where we're going to think about legislation, litigation, and organizing. So this is the start that's leading towards this that very important sort of more action step. And I also want us to, in this panel, as part of laying out the facts, to really flesh out some of the points that Professor Orfield has raised, so some important points. So let me start with you, Lisa. So some people might say, why does this matter? Birds of a feather flock together. People of the same race simply want to live together. Is this a problem, or why is this a problem? What would you say?
Thank you, Algernon. So that discussion is very interesting, and it's a mantra that we hear quite often, that people choose to be segregated, they choose to be isolated. That's not true. Myron talked about some of the ways that people have experienced housing discrimination, and let me also say that discrimination from the perspective of housing in the United States has been both de facto and de jure. So our federal government has engaged in ways that have created and perpetuated residential segregation in the United States. 10 years ago, NAFA released a book that was edited by Jim Carr and Nandini Kuti, called Segregation, the Rising Cost for Americans. And in that book, we talk about some of the de jure practices implemented by our federal, state, and local governments that led to and perpetuated segregation. We are more segregated today than we were 100 years ago because of these practices. And the important thing that I would like us to know, I thought they were putting it there. The important thing that I think it's important for us to remember is that because of residential segregation, because of the creation of communities isolated based on race, that has fed into the creation of two different societies and two different systems. So we have different systems and different ways in which we carry out our policies, in which we practice our marketplace transactions that have different impact on people. So, for example, when you look at education and access to education, because of residential segregation, children of color tend to be educated in schools that are subpar. In the United States, we spend $333 more on white students than we do students of color. White students tend to attend schools where teachers are more senior in terms of their status, they have more experience. White students tend to attend schools where teachers have advanced degrees and where teachers are teaching in their field of expertise. Not so for African American students. African Americans and Latinos tend to live in food deserts. Latinos are a third less likely, and blacks half less likely to live in a neighborhood where there is a grocery store. 8% of blacks live in a census tract with no grocery store at all compared to, 8% of blacks live in a census tract with a grocery store compared to 31% of whites. I hail from the great state of Ohio. I was born and raised in Toledo, Ohio, a stone's throw away from Detroit, which is a predominantly African American community. And for decades, for over 30 years, the city of Detroit, the entire city, didn't have one grocery store in it. African Americans and Latinos are more likely to live in health deserts. One cardiologist put it this way. He said, your zip code, when it comes to your health, your zip code is more important than your genetic code. And that is primarily because there are fewer health facilities in communities of color, and there are also fewer primary care physicians in communities of color. And the thing that I've been focusing my attention on for the past several years is access to credit and financial access in America. Because we are living in racially isolated communities, and if you go to the next slide, the racialization of where we live perpetuated the development of a dual credit market. And our dual credit market functions differently based on where you live. So if you look at this slide, you'll see on the tan side, that represents the fringe lending market. That's the non-traditional space. Some people are using the term alternative financial services. And in that space, you'll see payday lenders, check cashers, buy here, pay here, auto lenders, title lenders, and the like. On the blue side is our financial mainstream. That's where our banks are operating, our credit unions. Now, the difference about these two segments of the market is that our non-traditional credit providers are less regulated. And they tend to offer credit in a clandestine way. It's very cloak and veil. If you access credit on that tan side, it is more likely than not that your credit provider will not report your positive payments to the credit repositories. Now, in a perverse arrangement, if you don't pay your credit obligations on time, they escalate referring your file to a collection agency, and that collection agency will report your negative behavior to the credit repository systems. On the blue side, those credit providers, because they are regulated, are required to report your positive payments to the credit repository agencies. And that is why in the United States, African Americans and Latinos, Native Americans, Hawaiian natives, and Pacific Islanders are disproportionately credit invisible. That is, they don't have any credit that a credit repository agency can pick up and funnel that information to a credit modeler like FICO. FICO is a credit modeler. Equifax would be a credit repository agency. And therefore, you don't get a credit score, and therefore, you cannot get access to prime credit, and therefore, the cycle repeats itself. It's a catch-22. And unfortunately, banks, regulated financial institutions are not present in communities of color. We have a separate and unequal financial system that perpetuates the wealth divide, the wealth gap that we see in the United States of America. So when we talk about residential segregation, we're not just talking about merely people living in communities where they're separated by race. We're talking about the perpetuation of systems that treat people differently based on the racial composition of the neighborhood. And that drives all kinds of disparate outcomes for Americans.
Great, thank you very much. So Paul, you've, not too long ago, you published a report on the architecture of segregation, and you're one of the leading experts on segregation and concentrated poverty. Lisa's given us a sense of why we should be concerned about this. And Myron also said that it's kind of invisible. In our discourse, we don't talk about it. I mean, you can even go so far as some people say that, you know, with the Brown decision, we became an integrated society. People might have that viewpoint. So how much of a problem is segregation today? Are things getting better, worse? Is it staying the same? Where are we in terms of the state of segregation?
Okay, I'll start with this notion that somehow we're past it. And a few years ago, a few Harvard economists published a paper which they called The End of the Segregated Century. They meant well, but they were completely wrong. And they made a few mistakes. For one thing, they made two major mistakes. And one of the major mistakes was that they looked at segregation of blacks from non-blacks. And when they did that, essentially there were many smaller metropolitan areas where, especially in the South and West, where Hispanics were moving into formerly low-income neighborhoods and black neighborhoods. And so if you just did it that way, it looked as if there was some integration going on. But when we talk about segregation, what we really mean is a group that's being excluded from opportunities, from resources, and things of that nature, which basically the majority the majority group holds. And so you really need to look at segregation as the minority group from the majority group. So you need to look at segregation of blacks from non-Hispanic whites. When you do that, the numbers look different, and you don't see the big declines that they were talking about. The second thing that they did wrong has to do with the fact that they were looking at these metropolitan areas, and they did a good job of measuring things the way they did it, but they didn't sort of seem to get that the places that had have the largest black populations, and this scale is logarithmic, so in the middle there is 100,000, it goes up to 1 million there. There was a very strong correlation between the level of racial segregation and the size of the black population in different metropolitan areas. So the places where blacks actually live are the most segregated. And in fact, I use the index of dissimilarity to measure segregation. So a number like 0.6, that indicates that 60% of all whites or 60% of all blacks would have to move to a different neighborhood to achieve an even distribution of people across the metropolitan area. So you see that more than half of blacks lived in areas where it's 60%. That number is very high by historical standards. The Italians, Norwegians, since I'm here, no group has ever been that segregated, even when they were at the height of their immigration move into this country. And yet blacks here and African Americans have now, still have, many of them live in communities that are 0.6 or higher. And in fact, 1/4 live in metropolitan areas where 70%, where the index of dissimilarity is 0.7, and even 1 in 10 lives in some of the metropolitan areas where it's 0.8, which is a phenomenal number. If you're talking about segregation that's index of dissimilarity of 0.6 or 0.7, especially around 0.8, what you really see when you look at the map is that you have most of the neighborhoods are either 80% black or 80% white, and very few in between. You know, you might have a 5-color scheme to do your maps, but you only end up using 2 of those colors, the 2 ends, when you have these highly segregated metropolitan areas. So that segregation is still here, particularly in places where African Americans happen to live. If we could go to the next one, I'll just show you as an example some cities. And you have New York there, where even, although there's been slight declines in this index of dissimilarity, that's the last column there, basically the levels are still very, very high. And places like New York and you have Detroit, so on, where it's above 0.8, also Milwaukee and Newark. These happen to be the 10 metropolitan areas that have the largest black populations, and so you see there's quite a high level of segregation in most of those cities. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And as bad as those numbers are, it's not the worst of it, because what I also did was I decided to look at segregation of people enrolled in school, kids enrolled in school. And so it turns out that to the extent that we've had some integration, it tends to be people like me, empty nesters, moving into the inner city, or it tends to be young professionals. Whites that have children are not part of that integration that's going on, even to the small extent that it's going on. So that if you find that this is now the averages for 384 metropolitan areas, this is 85% or more of the entire population of the country lives in these metropolitan areas. And the overall average is 0.6 across all those metropolitan areas. So that's high. But if you look at, say, kids enrolled in elementary school, it comes out to about 0.72. And for kids enrolled in pre-K, the segregation of black and white kids enrolled in pre-K is 0.8. So even though we might see some movement in the top line number, it's not changing the experience of a child growing up in a neighborhood. When they go to school, that's school, they're attending mostly with people who look just like them. So let's go to the next slide. Now I want to switch gears a little bit, because one of the ways in which there's slight declines in racial segregation, but at the very same time, we're seeing an increase in economic segregation. And what do I mean by that? I mean the inequality between neighborhoods. So the bottom line there, the blue line, is the increasing inequality among households. We all know, a lot of talk about inequalities increasing. And it is, just about everywhere. And that's driven by all kinds of things: globalization, returns to skill, technology, eliminating jobs, all kinds of things. So that's the blue line. So there's more inequality to go around. But the red line is the inequality among neighborhoods. And both of these are measured by the Gini coefficient, which we can talk about if anybody wants to. But the inequality of neighborhoods has grown much faster since 1980 than the inequality of households. So what that means is that not only is there more inequality to go around, as it were, but people are sorting out more into different neighborhoods. And so it's both things are happening at the same time. And that has led to basically economic segregation to increase. The segregation of the rich from the poor, segregation by your social class or income. But that's not happening the same way everywhere. The next slide shows 4 metropolitan areas. And I have to turn around and know right from left. So yeah, here on the right, we see 2 cities, Denver and Minneapolis, where, yeah, inequality increased, the blue line, because it increased everywhere. It's being driven by international things. But inequality of neighborhoods also increased because there was more inequality to go around. But the way they were building houses, the way that the neighborhoods were developing, school assignment policies, something was being done in those areas so there wasn't more sorting. So neighborhoods got a little more unequal just because people were more unequal. Whereas on the left, you see that Philadelphia and Phoenix, and I could have put 100 other ones up there, had both an increase in inequality and a more rapid increase in neighborhood inequality, meaning that in those cities, people were sorting out more. Now, what exactly is driving that? Well, some of that is how public policy. It's exclusionary zoning. It's building the suburbs with only one kind of income of house that only rich people can live in, so that people are sorting out more as they get more income and using their gains to separate themselves from the rest of society. So we definitely see this trend towards economic segregation increasing. So even as there's a slight decline in racial segregation, we see this increase in economic segregation. The next slide, I'm going to cross them over now. We're going to look at both at the same time. And what you see here is index of dissimilarity for 4 different income groups, and then again by race. So less than 25,000 is roughly poor, 25 to 50,000, we'll call that working class, and just titles. 50 to 100,000, say that's middle class, and above 100,000 of household income, we'll call that affluent. And what you see is that even among whites, that poor are segregated from the affluent household. So, but it's only 0.4, so it's not that segregated, but it's still somewhat segregated. Whereas black poor are more segregated from black affluent households. That number is, if you click you get some boxes here highlighting the numbers I'm talking about. Yeah, go to the second one. There you go, 0.65. So that's a pretty high level of segregation. But then I thought, let me think about this for a second. Let's look at how segregated each of those African American income groups is from affluent whites, the people that actually have the money, that have the good schools, that have built these suburban neighborhoods. And so what you see is that poor blacks are, and again, this is all 380 metropolitan areas in the United States put together, and it's almost 0.8 segregation of poor blacks from those affluent whites that control most of the resources and opportunities. And one more click, and the interesting thing is that affluent black households, those black households making more than $100,000, are segregated at 0.67 from affluent whites. So if you think about this, it's really pretty astonishing that affluent black households are far more segregated from affluent whites than white households making less than $25,000 a year. So I think the segregated century is not over. We're still living in segregation, and it causes all the problems that Lisa and Myron have talked about, and I think we have a long way to go to try to deal with it.
So, Alex, you represented Dorothy Gautreaux in the landmark Supreme Court case in 1966, where you successfully challenged racially segregated public housing in Chicago. Now, you once wrote that racial segregation has political and policy implications well beyond the social spaces of isolation and marginalization that we call the ghetto. So what are the political and policy implications or ramifications of the ghetto today?
Yes, Algernon, and I think they're serious. Lisa's told us how the implications affect the residents of the ghetto. And Paul has told us that, hey, this isn't getting better, it's getting worse. I'll focus for a couple of minutes, as you've asked me to, Algernon, on what it means for the rest of America, people who don't live in the ghetto. And here, too, the story is not a very pleasant one. Jason DeParle of the New York Times once put it this way: the poverty and disorder of inner cities lacerate a larger civic fabric, drawing people from shared institutions like schools, and even from cities themselves. Perhaps most damaging of all is the effect on race relations. It is like he said. It is like a poison in the national groundwater that is producing 1,000 deformed fruits. Poison in the national groundwater. So I think the parle puts it pretty well, and in my few minutes, I'd like to give you 2.5 examples of the parle's deformed fruits. Why 2.5? Well, it's really 3, but I'm saying 2.5 because my third example isn't going to require any discussion. It's self-evident. Okay, deformed fruit number 1. Nothing less than the breakup of the coalition that birthed the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement. Now, how could that be, some of you will ask? How could a coalition that put social justice in play on the American board for 3 decades, from the New Deal through the Fair Deal, through the Great Society, how could that be broken apart by the black ghetto? Well, I'll tell you. We all know that the American psyche underwent a fundamental change in 1968 when a victorious Richard Nixon slammed the doors on both school desegregation and housing desegregation. You'll remember he called the latter forced integration of the suburbs. Now, how did that happen? Well, there's no single explanation, but a major factor, and I would say the major factor, was disaffection by the blue-collar workers and the white ethnics who had been a core element of the New Deal coalition. Disaffection over what? The answer is disaffection over the one concern that for them trumped, you pardon that use of the, for the one concern that for them trumped all others. When I was putting down my notes, I didn't think about that. I have to work. Somebody got a thesaurus. Is there a good alternative? So what was that one concern that was more important than any other? Answer, fear of blacks from ghettos trying to, quote, invade their neighborhoods. That was the fear we all know Nixon played to over and over again. That subliminal appeal to the anti-black voter, as John Ehrlichman wrote, was always present in Nixon's statements and speeches. And by 1972, just 4 years later, George Wallace not only won the Michigan Democratic primary, but he swept every single predominantly white ward in Detroit, where the blue-collar whites and the white ethnics had once voted overwhelmingly for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Race had eclipsed class as the organizing principle of American politics, as a number of writers have observed, and the eclipsing was caused in large part because we had herded poor blacks into ghettos, where they became the feared other, threatening adjacent white homes and neighborhoods. Okay, my second example of a deformed fruit caused by that poison in our national groundwater. Second one is the war on drugs, targeted on black ghettos. When Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter, most Americans did not attribute crime to the coddling of criminals. A 1982 ABC poll, and there are many others like this, reported that 58% of Americans believed unemployment and poverty were the most important causes of crime, and only 12% thought that lenient courts were to blame. But in his 1980 campaign, following Nixon's example of 12 years earlier, Reagan paid lots of attention to crime in the streets, and he vowed that if he were elected, the federal government would do something about it. That became a campaign promise. Unhappily, that was kept. A focus on drugs became the federal lever, with massive increases in anti-drug budgets for the FBI and other drug enforcement agencies. And with Democrats fearing to appear soft on crime, dashing to catch the political train, tough new anti-drug legislation became grist for the congressional mill. Severe penalties for possession of even small amounts of crack cocaine, mandatory minimum sentences, and the like. And let me ask, was there a focus for this massive new law enforcement effort of ours? You bet there was. Here's what criminologist Michael Tonry says in his great book, Malign Neglect. Quote, anyone with knowledge of drug trafficking patterns and police arrest policies and incentives could have foreseen that the enemy troops in the war on drugs would consist largely of young inner-city minority males. And we know the results. The war was a complete failure. Dealers weren't cleared from the streets, prices didn't rise, crack and other drugs did not become harder to find or buy, drug violence persisted, but disproportionate punishment of blacks, especially young black males, began to get worse, much worse. The number of blacks in prison soon doubled, then tripled. 10 years after Reagan's election, nearly 1 in 4 young black Americans was under the control of the criminal justice system, one way or another. And in major cities, the numbers were staggeringly higher. And the war goes on, and so do the consequences. Today, our incarcerated population in America is the largest in the world. We have close to 25% of the world's prisoners, even though we make up only 5% of the world's population. Our rate of incarceration is 5 to 10 times what it is in other democracies, and blacks have been incarcerated at up to 7 times the rate of whites. And which blacks in particular? Consistent with Michael Tonry's observation, it is, of course, mainly young males whose criminal responsibility may be real, but according to the National Academy of Sciences, quote, is embedded in a context of social and economic disadvantage. That is embedded in the black ghetto. In short, driven by a color-coded reaction to the black ghetto, we are doggedly pursuing a racially distorted mass incarceration policy that is both mindless and destructive of American values. Okay, my third and final example, the one I called half an example of a deformed fruit because it's self-evident. It's school desegregation. Now, 60 years post-Brown, a thing of the past. All I need do here is to quote from Richard Rothstein's wonderful book, The Color of Law. Our schools are and remain segregated, Rothstein says, because our neighborhoods are and remain segregated. We cannot desegregate schools without desegregating neighborhoods. So, well, I take that applause for Rothstein. So once again, the poisonous groundwater of black ghettoization has produced a deformed fruit. This time, it's a turning of our backs upon the vision of a desegregated public school system that Brown unfurled for us. So yes, Algernon, in answer to your question, I say to you that black ghettos have been and are poisoning America.
Thank you. And I think, I mentioned early that I feel like when we teach about the Brown decision, we forget the point that Alex has made and that Paul has made, in that our schools are still not just a little segregated, but highly segregated. And if we don't tell that story, I mean, that gets back to Professor Orfield of how we don't see the segregation that's very visible and very obvious around us. So I wanted to go a little further and now to get some ideas and some thoughts, dig a little deeper, look a little bit towards maybe some ideas for some solutions, and also a little deeper into some of the work that you all are doing. So Lisa, you're with the National Fair Housing Alliance, and the work that your organization does, you track and fight segregated lending practices that you emphasize. Is there any other work that you're doing, or how do you go about fighting the institutional practices that you presented?
Well, we do, of course, more than address lending discrimination. That's just been sort of the highlight of my bailiwick over the past 5 or so years. But the National Fair Housing Alliance is a trade association made up of fair housing organizations from across the United States. We have about 100 fair housing groups that operate in local communities across the country. And those organizations engage in investigations of housing discrimination complaints. So consumers who think that they have been discriminated against based on, a bailiwick of experiences, and it could be with respect to the rental housing market, it could be with respect to trying to purchase a house, or financing or insuring a home, the zoning of neighborhoods, so that it really runs the gamut. And our local fair housing organizations, there are a number of them here in the audience today. You should raise your hands if you're here. So there's a lot of fair housing practitioners in the audience, and these are the folks who are on the ground, they're out in the field, they're conducting the investigations, they're doing the testing, they're doing the surveying to ferret out whether or not there is illegal housing discrimination going on. And then the fair housing organizations bring those cases in a number of venues. So there's an administrative route through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, but then there's also the court system that we utilize to bring about justice and to stop housing discrimination actions. So it runs the gamut. It's not just lending, and I apologize if I gave that
not at all.
that
No,
impression.
not at all.
And we use a bevy of laws. We use, of course, the Federal Fair Housing Act, but we also use the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is the oldest fair housing act on the books. We, of course, use the 14th Amendment, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and there are a number of state anti-discrimination laws that we use to expand equal housing opportunities.
Great. So Paul, in that report that you did not too long ago, it was titled The Architecture of Segregation. Can you say a little bit of why you chose to call it The Architecture of Segregation?
Yes, so...
And maybe you can move your mic a little bit.
All right. So the idea that I had there was that, as Myron put it, this is not about people just choosing to live one place or another. There's a whole set of institutions and laws and policies and practices that go into creating these highly segregated neighborhoods. Everything from exclusionary zoning, which is just up front in what it does, but also steering by real estate agents, the whole set of lending practices and credit issues. All those things create the neighborhoods that are in such a way that we have this high degree of segregation. So that's kind of an architecture of laws and policies that has to be dismantled before it has to be attacked before you can really do something about segregation. And the other thing is that sort of a double entendre, because once you build these housing units, the whole huge neighborhoods that have 4,000 square foot houses, one after another. Those houses persist for a long time. Even if we could change all those policies and practices tomorrow, we still have that existing architecture of segregation that we built that will take some time to unbuild and to reshape. So both of those senses of the word led me to use that term, architecture of segregation. Yeah. Because this is not just choices, it's something big and strong and durable.
Yeah, so I found it very provocative. And you also point out that, our tax dollars subsidize this, building this architecture. Getting back to some of the other work, this is not, this didn't just happen. There's both federal, state, and local policies that built up the segregation that we see today. Creating this, and the flip side that Alex pointed out is the sort of the poison water. So, Alex, do you have? So we've got a sense that there's a lot of work to be done, that it's very difficult. Do you have any ideas about how do we remove the poison from this water? Do you have any ideas about strategies that we should be looking at? And I know that later on we'll dive more deeply into this, but what are your thoughts at this point?
Well, I have no magic answer. You know that, of course. Paul Scully is here, so organizing's got to be at the bottom rung of the ladder of anything we do. That's a $64,000 question. I'm fortunate enough, privileged, I should say, to sit on the board of the Inclusive Communities Project in Dallas. Betsy Julian, the founding president of that organization, is here, as is Demetria McCain, I think, the executive director. Well, I know, Paul's slide showed intensive, continuing segregation in the 10 largest metropolitan areas in the country where most blacks live. And we know from Rothstein that that's not happenstance. That came about as a deliberate, de jure result of continuous action over decades and decades by the federal government. So how do we undo that? The Inclusive Communities Project in Dallas, and I was interested to see that Dallas was one of the ones, 0.05 on your slide, Paul, that was making, relatively speaking, the most progress. Inclusive Communities Project in Dallas has, over the last half dozen years or so, envisioned a comprehensive attack on the segregation of the the persisting segregation in the Dallas metropolitan area. By comprehensive, I mean there's organizing, there's going out and talking to people, there's the running of a mobility program, and there's multifaceted litigation to deal with the multiple ways in which this continuing metropolitan area segregation in Dallas is persisting. Now, it's a long-term effort, not going to happen overnight, but they are making progress, and particularly in light of the HUD affirmatively furthering rule, which, God help us, may someday get off the ground and be implemented. There are some levers there that the public housing authorities and other governmental agencies have a legal obligation to identify the barriers to desegregation and to do something about it. So the answer to your specific question, do I have any ideas? I think careful studying of the thoughtful analysis of how to attack desegregation in Dallas by the Integrated Communities Project could be undertaken and replicated in other major metropolitan areas around the country. Long-term job, but I think that's one potentially useful place to enter to begin.
Great, thank you. And I think-
Algernon, can I jump in on
Oh,
that
please,
question?
go right ahead.
And so I just want to go back to actually piggybacking on both of the questions that you asked, both Paul and Alex. And what strikes me is the name of Paul's book, right? The Architecture of Segregation. So when you think about all of the variant components of our society, of our economy, of our political system, of our marketplace that have come together to create and perpetuate, to design segregation, think about the systemic, comprehensive strategy that we have to put in place to undo it. So let me give you just one factoid. We, in terms of African American homeownership, the African American homeownership rate is where it was 50 years ago when we passed the Federal Fair Housing Act. Now, we did make gains in the African American homeownership rate in the ensuing years from the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act. But because the architecture of segregation is so strong and so well put together, all of these variant forces work together to undo and strip away all of the gains that we made. So that dual credit market that I showed you up there, right? It worked in design so that all of the gains that we made forced African Americans, even high-income African Americans, to disproportionately access home mortgage credit outside of the financial mainstream. So when African American homeowners and borrowers qualified for prime credit, the system steered them. It was designed to steer them into the subprime market where they got unsustainable credit and then ultimately were subjected to foreclosure and lost their houses. The Prosperity Now did a study in which they looked at income disparities and wealth disparities in America, and they found that if we hold white wealth constant at today's rate, so that means that whites cannot gain any more in wealth than what they have today, and if black wealth and Latino wealth continue to grow at historical levels, it would take Latinos 84 years to reach parity with whites. It would take African Americans 228 years to reach parity with whites. So that tells you, I think it gives you an idea of the depth that we have to go in order to dismantle this system.
I just want to add a footnote that the study and the figures you've just referred to, Lisa, make favorable assumptions. If you make some more realistic assumptions, blacks never attain wealth parity with whites.
I'm going to have to cut this panel short, not because it isn't a wonderful panel, but we have the president of the NAACP coming on a tight schedule, and so we need to take a break now for a few minutes, and then we'll come back to our next panel, but I'd like to thank you.
Okay, yeah, let's thank the panel.
Okay. Well, I want to introduce, or I want to recognize a few people that are present today that have been helpful and supportive of our conference, and then I want to get the Kresge Foundation up. Everybody, come on, let's. What? Okay. Could the Sergeant at Arms direct the absent members? Let's come back into order. All right. Thank you. I wanted to recognize a few people who have been very supportive in this conference and are here today. Julie Blaha, who is the Secretary-Treasurer of the Minnesota AFL-CIO, is here. Lloyd Henderson, the President of the Camden County NAACP. W.C. Jordan, the President of the Minnesota Dakota branch of the NAACP, is here today. General Parker, the President of the Central Illinois chapter of the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, is here today. And Felix Ortiz, the Assistant Secretary of the New York State Assembly, is here today, and there are many others that I'm sure that we won't recognize. But before we start again, I want to bring up a major benefactor for this conference, the Kresge Foundation, which has been very supportive of our institute at the university and the civil rights movement throughout the country. And David Newsome is going to speak just for a few minutes.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is David Newsome. I'm the special assistant to the president of the Kresge Foundation, who gives his regards and regrets that he could not be here today. We are very, very excited and honored to see this event come together and to be a part of it. Just want to say a few words about why we're so excited and what we think is so inspiring about this work. The Kresge Foundation exists, and our mission is to expand opportunities in American cities. And as we heard from the last panel, we know from our work in health and education, and particularly our work in our hometown of Detroit, that we will fail in a mission to expand opportunity unless we directly address the legal, the social, the economic, and all of the systems that cause us to be segregated based on the color of our skin, where we come from, and the language that we speak. We think that any philanthropic activity, any nonprofit activity, any government activity, any activity at all that does not directly confront those systems cannot be successful in expanding opportunity and making change happen. When we were approached by the Institute with the idea for this summit, what we thought was particularly inspired and inspiring was the notion of bringing a coalition of activists and passionate people from civil rights organizations, from labor organizations, from religious organizations, from academic organizations. And this is something that makes so much sense, but so rarely happens. Everybody's so specialized that too often we forget to come together and work together. And as a year ago we saw, the importance of being unified is really going to be critical for us to continue to have progress. So we are honored again to be here. We are also very excited about the fact that this isn't just a moment where we all come together, but that a very deliberate part of being here is what happens tomorrow in the committees, where we talk about how do we organize, how do we have litigation, how do we have legislative strategies, that it's not just a matter of coming together and having one voice, but it's also moving forward with one agenda. So we are very excited to be here, very excited to be a part of what goes forward, and we look forward to seeing what comes of this. So thank you.
So I'm going to bring up our next presenter, David Rusk, who is the former mayor of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and a great scholar of urban segregation and of issues like fragmentation, how cities that are competing with each other and zoning against each other can increase segregation, and more cooperative regional planning and working together can help reduce those trends. He was also a longtime civil rights worker before he was the mayor of Albuquerque. So let me introduce David Rusk, the founding president of Building One America.
Well, thank you very much, Myron. And thank you all for being here. I see many familiar faces, and of course a lot more that I don't recognize, and I welcome you to this effort. Back in 1957, in response to critics complaining about his very lackadaisical support for implementing the Brown decision, President Dwight D. Eisenhower responded, "You can't legislate morality. You can't legislate morality." Well, I would respond, you can legislate conduct. I'm not sure that I responded in that way back in 1957, but you can legislate conduct of both individuals and, importantly, of institutions. And no one has done a better job of tracing that reality, I think, than what Richard Rothstein, whom Alex Polikoff already mentioned, his new book, The Color of Law, subtitled A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And I would encourage anyone who has not read this yet to get a copy and to read it. We had hoped, I think, that he, rather than I, would be standing here today to deliver this message, but it didn't work out with his very busy schedule, and so I am standing in for that function. But he emphasizes that you can legislate both good conduct but also bad conduct. And the history of America has been yin and yang. It's been a Manichaean struggle constantly between the good and the bad, tracing all the way back really to the beginnings of this country. And on this issue, the beginning was 1619, when the first Africans arrived in Jamestown in British America as slaves on a Dutch ship. 1619. We are 2 years removed from 2019, the 400th anniversary of that event. That means that we are standing on the brink of the 5th century, working together, black and white, to build this nation. A message that I've been trying to deliver for the whole 8 years of the Obama administration. A message that, come on folks, let's get it right as we go into our 5th century together. And it now appears that we're in one of those moments when we lose some ground. But rather than going back 400 years, let's just go back 100 years. Let's go back to 1917. We are on the 100th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision in Buchanan versus Worley, in which the Supreme Court banned racial zoning, a practice that had been inaugurated by the city of Baltimore in 1910, was followed by many other communities, and the Supreme Court banned it, said you cannot do that. So in response, communities began to basically continue with the practice, but under a different guise with somewhat different instruments, one of which was inclusionary zoning, which I'll talk about in a minute, but a clear substitute with the same intent was the use of racially restrictive covenants in the sale of residential housing. In fact, the Supreme Court said in 1926, just 9 years after they banned racial zoning, the Supreme Court said, racial covenants in which the purchaser commits that they'll never sell this property to an African American or another whole long list of undesired people. The Supreme Court said, this is all right, because this is just a private contractual agreement between two private parties. So the Supreme Court gave an open door to the use of racial covenants for decades. And that was only overturned by the Supreme Court again in 1948 in the Shelley versus Kramer decision, in which they finally recognized that a racial covenant isn't only enforceable by state action. So this was a state action that was unconstitutional in enforcing that kind of racial segregation. In 1926 also, when they were saying, racial covenants are all right, restrictive covenants are all right, they also approved zoning as a broad measure in Ambler Realty versus City of Euclid. And that was typically presented as an enlightened way to try to make sure that industrial factories and commercial properties and like were not built in the middle of residential neighborhoods. But what it did also turn into was a use of exclusionary zoning, That is, to adopt seemingly race-neutral rules that you couldn't build apartments here, or you couldn't build duplexes or quadruplexes, or you couldn't do things that would allow people of lower incomes to move into a community of higher income single-family homes. That didn't begin to be countered until we got to the issue of local action. In 1973, Montgomery County, Maryland Council adopted the nation's first inclusionary zoning ordinance, and that movement has slowly spread. There are now about 400 counties, cities, and towns throughout the country that have adopted inclusionary zoning, which says that a certain percentage of the new housing created must be affordable to people in lower income groups. About 10% of the nation's population now lives in communities that have mandatory inclusionary zoning. But that means that 90% of the people do not. The overwhelming practice in the United States is to exclude, not to exclude, include, to exclude seemingly by income, but so often that has major impact in terms of excluding by race as well. The biggest impact that our federal government has had on the housing market has been through the organization by the federal government, really, of the nationwide housing mortgage system, of the national finance system. And it used to be that you'd have to put 50% down on a house to get a bank loan and pay it off in 5 years or so. I'm talking about decades ago. That still is the practice in a place like Argentina, for example. And yet in the middle of the Great Depression, the New Deal decided it had to help out all these homeowners that were losing their houses because they couldn't meet those kinds of mortgage terms. So they organized the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, and to take over these and to refinance them as low down deposits and low monthly payments. That was carried into the new housing market by the Federal Housing Administration. But both of those adopted the practice of judging neighborhoods by supposed risk. And they divided up the nation's cities into 5 different categories of risk, neighborhoods by risk, with the highest risks being coded on maps in red. And somehow invariably, black neighborhoods or integrated neighborhoods would be coded as the highest risk neighborhoods. They would be redlined. And when you're redlined, the government will no longer insure or guarantee a housing loan. And so that was adopted in 1945, a practice by the Veterans Administration as well. By 1950, half of all of the new housing being built in America was insured or guaranteed by the FHA or the VA, excluding African Americans from the era of the greatest creation of wealth, of family household wealth in our nation's history. And so we lost out. That didn't begin to change until Robert C. Weaver, African American, became the head of the administrator of the Housing and Home Finance Agency, which morphed then into the new Department of Housing and Urban Development in the middle and late 1960s, when the federal government finally stopped those practices of its own actions. And then that was beefed up to a degree, modest degree, by the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Beyond the impact through the mortgage market, the second greatest impact that the federal government has had on the geography of opportunity is through highway construction. The government itself, the federal government, has no land use powers. That's powers that rest in state governments that they delegate to local governments. As a matter of fact, the federal government has no direct responsibility for local governments at all, unless they violate somebody's rights as a national citizen. But with the passage of the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act of 1956, the federal government committed itself to building 41,000 miles of interstate highways between, but most importantly, through and around the nation's cities. And that really underwrote suburban expansion at a time when suburban expansion was really only for white people, not for black people. I've calculated that we have spent 8 times as much federal dollars in building highways as we have in federal support for mass transit, which serves our cities much better. Moreover, in the course of building all these highways, somehow the routes selected so many times through cities were right through neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, often viable, very viable black neighborhoods. And when you combine the impact of dislocation from highway construction with the 1949 Housing Act's launching of federal urban renewal, which resulted in Negro removal, this was a set of actions that destroyed many viable black or integrated neighborhoods as they existed and increased the level of segregation. Federal public housing has never helped to further racial or economic integration, at least not until we got to the Hope 6 program in 1992. For example, the very first federal public housing was built during World War I, when the government built 170,000 units of housing for factory workers in war industries. It was explicitly, exclusively for white workers. Black workers in those same factories had to find places they lived, could live generally in black neighborhoods far from the factory sites. In 1933, the New Deal initiated the Public Works Administration with a specific policy of racial segregation. There were 24 public housing projects exclusively for white. There were 17 public housing projects exclusively for blacks. There were 6 integrated projects, but integrated meant that all the whites would be in one building and all the blacks would be in another building in the same project, for example. In 1937, the U.S. Housing Authority took over the responsibilities of the Public Works Administration and helped to promote a system of local housing authorities around the country, all of which were pursuing the same policies of segregated housing. We come down to 1974, and there's a new idea. Let's replace projects with housing vouchers, with Section 8 vouchers. And in theory, the Section 8 vouchers could be used by a family that owns the voucher in anywhere, whether they're white or black. But in reality, the program helped to concentrate poverty in a greater level. For example, I fairly recently looked at the 4 suburban counties of Philadelphia, where 11,000 housing choice vouchers are being used. 89% of those housing choice vouchers were being used in low and minimum opportunity communities. Only 4% were being used in in high and maximum opportunity communities. Well, people will say, well, because they couldn't, the rents were higher in the higher opportunity communities, and they couldn't be used there. That is nonsense, people. That is nonsense. According to census data, in those high opportunity communities, there were 22,000 apartments that fell within the rental ranges that would have been appropriate for use of a housing choice voucher, based upon those public housing authorities' own data as to their average costs. And very simply, they just weren't making any effort to reach out to find these properties in which they could locate families in communities with growing job supplies, with high-performance schools in safe neighborhoods. Schools, we've mentioned, had a good deal of talk about that. There was explicit de jure segregation in the South until Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. There was implicit de jure segregation throughout the North and the West throughout that same time, in which, and in 20 years after Brown, 20 years after the Warren Court said civil rights is preeminent in our concerns, the Warren Burger Court, the Burger Court in Milliken v. Bradley said that no, that suburbs don't have any responsibility for participating in regional desegregation plans unless you can prove that they took explicit segregative action. Basically, whereas the Warren Court had said civil rights is the priority for this nation, the Burger Court said, oh no, home rule rights, Trump used that again, civil rights. One final consideration is the structure of local government. You can really divide this nation between little boxes regions and big box regions. Little boxes regions are where there's a city or a town or a township everywhere in every part of a metropolitan area. There's no unincorporated land. Little boxes states are throughout New England, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, and all the states of the old Northwest Territories, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, not so much Indiana. Whereas the big box nations, states, are really everywhere else, where you have municipalities where there's been significant urbanization, but it's otherwise unincorporated area under counties per se. Little boxes regions facilitate dividing people. They facilitate segregation. They facilitate greater fiscal disparities amongst regions. Big box regions, they're not perfect by a long shot, but they tend to be somewhat less exclusive and more inclusive. And so I'm going to just call attention to Paul Jargowski's presentation of the data in the previous session. He showed you that there have been improvements in terms of a decline in racial and black-white segregation in the country. Actually, every metropolitan area since 1980 has seen a decline in the level of black-white segregation in the country. We're still highly segregated. We're still, well over 60 on Paul's numbers. What was less clear in Paul's presentation is that there's been a constant increase in economic segregation at the same time. Basically, Jim Crow by income is slowly replacing Jim Crow by race. and that it's the non-explicitly racial devices that maintain this. So we've gone through 400 years of seesawing back and forth of this Manichaean struggle between good and bad. And if you get discouraged at times, I'll just foreshadow for you the topic of one of our key speakers today. I'm always inspired by Dr. King, who said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." It does not bend toward justice because of some immutable law of physics. It bends toward justice by the constant efforts of people committed to creating greater social justice. And that is the challenge that we all face now. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to introduce Demetria McCain, who's going to moderate our next panel. She's with the Inclusive Communities Project in Dallas. Alexander Polikoff talked a little bit about the Inclusive Communities Project. It was a major civil rights win in a grim time for integrated housing in the suburbs of Dallas. And Demetria was an important person in creating that victory and planning out scattered site housing and in making sure in one of the toughest and harshest racial climates in the country, one of the shining victories in our recent legal history. So Demetria, I'm going to let you take over the panel, and thank you for coming.
All right. So, can you hear me? Is this working? Great, super. I just want to repeat something that David said, because I think it will be kind of like the theme of what we're about to engage in during this session, is you can legislate conduct, especially institutions. And while I adore Richard Rothstein's book, and the title of it is The Forgotten History of How Government Segregated America, it could be called The Hidden History of How the Government Segregated America. So with that, my job is to moderate among these three very major heavy hitter thought leaders of our time. And Paul will kill me if I don't stick to the plan, but I think you're going to be inspired and hopefully moved to want to do something after this particular session. Now let's just go back for a second to the session that we just heard, if we could. So we heard a little bit about what we're living with today, right? We heard about how Black communities that are segregated, high poverty concentration, have health deserts. We heard about how those communities have food deserts. We heard about how they are targeted for predatory lending, targeted for activities of the prison industrial complex, and essentially under-resourced as far as education and schools go. Yes, we all heard that. All right, so how is it we're still here, right? David walked us through some post-war activities and decisions made by major decision makers, but we do have today, 2017, policies, decisions, and decision makers engaging in activities or perhaps omitting to engage in activities that we know could change the tide of things. So I want to start right now with Bruce. All right, and Bruce, if you haven't had a chance to read your booklet, is a sociology professor at UC Davis. He talks of and studies and researches issues related to race, ethnicity, and segregation. He actually is not from that coast. He's from the other coast, where I've spent a little time. He's from Harlem, and he has written about growing up middle class in Harlem. He talks about growing up pretty well off in Harlem, and again, I think the word is relative, right? So I'm going to ask him to kind of start us out today talking about what segregation has meant for African Americans politically, socially, economically, both for those who are still confined to high poverty segregated neighborhoods and for African Americans who no longer live in those neighborhoods. So Bruce, help us out.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. I guess I'd refer us back to Professor Dragowski's comments about the Black middle class still having high levels of segregation. And I guess I'd start there by saying, of course, segregation for the poor is a problem that's specific for poor people. But segregation has characterized the existence for the black poor and the black middle class. And segregation is systematic and it has to do with both government policies, federal policies, state policies, as well as the actions of realtors and real estate agents doing engaged in block busting and racial steering and kinds of private activities, as well as the desires of homeowners.
Hold on a second, please. All right, let's see that.
As well as homeowners white homeowners who repeatedly describe a different composition in terms of their ideal community than blacks do. So for instance, black homeowners tend to say 50-50 black-white numbers, and they think of that as an integrated neighborhood. But most white homeowners think of much lower numbers. So there have been a number of studies, the Detroit area studies that have been done over the years that have showed a rather consistent resistance to integration on the part of large numbers of white homeowners. In terms of the consequence of segregation, I think we should think about this intersection between class and race, which we often want to say race is over here and class is over there, and try to substitute one for the other. But I think it's important to understand that racial subordination and its goal is to prevent access to the marketplace. It's to prevent access to the political marketplace. And so, by definition, black communities are under-resourced. And so people are funneled into particular spaces, and those spaces, which I refer to as racialized spaces, whether they be ghettos or middle-class spaces, have their resources systematically extracted from those neighborhoods. So whether or not we're talking about school closures in poor neighborhoods, or we're talking about sidewalks that were never built in middle-class black suburbs, for instance, there's an absence of resources. And I think it's important to understand that, and it's a term that hasn't come up yet, but gentrification, which is the current discussion, I would argue that gentrification could not take place the way it does today without the prior history of racial segregation. And in fact, racial segregation sets the groundwork for stripping communities and creating the rent gaps that then are taken advantage of by realtors and those looking to make money. So I think it's really important for us to always hold these two pieces in tandem together. The idea that race is a way of classifying people and denying them access to things like credit in the marketplace. So for instance, when we're talking about the HOLC and the formation of the residential zoning maps that banks use to advise the real estate industry about where good investment were, that once the real estate industry and the federal government said race was a criteria for credit worthiness, as soon as we did that, we created a two-tier system, two separate markets, one for blacks in housing and one for whites in housing. And with that being said, I also, again, the conversation has bothered me a little bit because we keep talking in black-white terms, and clearly we have a more complicated society than that. And it's important for us to keep in mind that when we talk about redlining, it was in fact Mexican Americans who were most isolated or targeted for not receiving mortgages. Blacks are actually number 2 on the target list. So it's important that when we think about the history of ghettos, that we also link it to the history of barrios, that we see this as a long tradition of racializing black and brown communities, isolating them, and stripping them of resources. And it's those conditions that, for families like myself, I grew up middle class. Both my parents have master's degrees in social work from the Atlanta School of Social Work, 1948. I grew up in a very middle class family. I got sent to prep school. But my family owned a piece of property that was in Harlem. And because of that, rather than being worth $10 or $20 million, which is what brownstones were worth downtown in Manhattan, I sold the house for a couple $100,000. And so it's that kind of ability to pass wealth across generations that is so significant for understanding the impact of segregation on the Black middle class.
Thank you, thank you. And so as we talk about, the problem might be my microphone. I don't know.
So would it help to have one mic on at a time?
Yeah, because we're not going to. Does that help? Okay.
Oh, it's might be my cell phone.
That was it.
Sorry.
It's my fault.
Now I don't have a clock anymore.
So you landed and you ended on this note about Black wealth, or the lack thereof, as it relates to some of these policies that are
The
problematic.
ability to accumulate wealth
Right,
across
right.
generations.
And often we read and know, and from our own experiences know, that it is that wealth that families have used to help put their kids through college. Yes.
Precisely. And in
Right.
2009, Black and Latino wealth was cut in half from the recession.
Wow. Wow.
So in other words, the accumulated wealth that people had amassed across generations was wiped out overnight.
Wow. Wow. So now we don't have any money to send our kids to college. And our kids are already in under-resourced schools. So Julian, take us there. Now you are the education director for the NAACP, yes?
California.
California, okay. Yes. California, United States, same thing,
Yes.
right?
You just gave me a promotion.
So Julian studies the impact of poverty and segregation on Black and Latino children, particularly in the education space. I want to move towards that. Now, tell us a little bit about how some of the approaches to deal with some of the issues that relate, that are the growth or the seeds of the problematic issues around neighborhoods of color when it comes to education. Talk about that a little bit, and then I want to ask you a few questions.
So first of all, glad to be here. I'm coming from California. You guys forgot to tell me how cold it is here. Wow. It's so rare that you get so many people that are interested in a panel about history. So what I want to really talk about is how inequality has paved the way for privatization and private control, charter schools and vouchers. But I want to take you back. I want to take you back to after Brown versus Board of Education. There was a white academic in Chicago. His name was Milton Friedman. Now this gentleman talked about how markets should be used in the provision of education. And in that provision, the idea was that private corporations and private individuals should run our school systems. That was the idea. And so there's a lot of conversation about who first uttered the word charter, who first uttered the word voucher. But we know right here in Minnesota in 1991 was the first charter. It's a charter school to recover students. It's a school still open today. In fact, in the 1990s, I came to St. Paul and volunteered in a Hmong charter school right on the river. And I can't remember the name of the school. And so there's this long-standing conversation about charter schools. But we have been studying charter schools now for a couple of decades, and there's a lot of research on charter schools, a lot of peer-reviewed research on charter schools. Gary Orfield, Myron's brother, has done research on segregation in charter schools and found that charter schools are about 17% more segregated than the neighborhood public schools that those students leave. Now, the challenge with this is that students, families, they're going from their already segregated neighborhood public schools to even more segregated charter schools. Now, the challenge with that is that these charter schools, the vast majority of charter schools, don't perform better than the neighborhood public schools. Credo's work shows that. And we have these conversations. I often have conversations with charter school proponents. I myself was a charter school board member. I was a charter school parent. I was an instructor at a charter school. But as the research has started to come in, I've changed my mind about the role of charter schools, the evolution of charter schools. So last week, or maybe it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, I've actually traveled 100,000 miles this year, so I'm a little tired. But I was in New York City a couple weeks ago. The charter school people asked me to come to their symposium, and it's all people who own and operate charter schools. And they made the point that, yes, we understand schools, our charter schools are more segregated. But the reason why they're more segregated is because we've self-determined them to be segregated. We've decided that they'll be segregated, and we're okay with that. It's an extension of the self-determination movement. The second point that they made, and I don't know if you're going to agree with them, I didn't agree with them, they said that there was no research that shows that integration is good for kids. This was the conversation at this charter school summit in New York City. And it was said earlier that this segregation is really the heart of the business plan. And I don't remember who it was here that said that. Maybe it was Dr. Orfield, I'm not sure. But in many ways, we're missing opportunities with charter schools, with magnets even. And the reason why I say that is if you think about Albert Shanker, who really brought the charter school idea to prominence in the late 1980s. The idea was that charter schools would be more community-based, that they would be more democratic, that they would even be run by teachers. That was the original vision of charter schools. But that's not where we've gone. Where we've gone is that school choice has resulted in schools that are even more segregated than the neighborhood public schools that we have. That they perform on average worse than the neighborhood public schools that they're nearby. That they have reduced educator quality. There's lots of research that shows that there's higher turnover of charter school students, they're less likely to be certified, and that there's less public transparency and accountability for charter schools, and that varies state to state. But there's less transparency. And I think that dovetails, because there's been very few people that have been willing to stand up to Broad, Gates, Walton Family Foundation. There's been very few people, but there have been civil rights organizations that have. The Journey for Justice, the Movement for Black Lives, and the NAACP have all called for a reassessment of what school choice is actually doing in communities of color across the United States. And so you saw a moratorium voted on by the members of the NAACP last year. They had a lot of conversation. I think it sparked a necessary conversation because we haven't been having conversations about segregation as a result of school choice. We have not been having conversations about transparency and accountability. We have not been having conversations about most of the Credo studies show that charters actually have a negative impact on black and brown kids. One quick side story, and then I'll bring it home, which is that I was in Philadelphia having one of these debates. The reason why it was a little north of Philadelphia, Reading. And the reason why I was there was because the local school district, which is the authorizer of the charter schools, having a disagreement with a charter school because they're poor performing, they're low performing. And so the authorizer said, we're gonna close you because you're a low performing charter school. And the charter school said, hell no, we're taking you to court. $500,000 later, they're still battling it out in court, right? And so they wanted to have this community conversation. And so I came to this debate prepared. There was a KIP TFA person there. And for those of you that keep up with ed reform, you probably know what that means. And so I made the point that the Credo study shows that charters actually have a negative impact on African American and Latino students across the state of Pennsylvania in the Credo study. So he came back, and I'm gonna be honest with you, I laid a little trap for him. So he came back and said, well, the Philadelphia study shows that Credo shows that charters are actually good for kids. And I told him, you know what, you need to read down a little farther in that study. Because what that study shows is that charters are actually great for white and Asian kids and have a negative impact on African American and Latino kids. You gotta keep reading the study. So I think the challenge is that we've got to make these conversations part of the public discourse. We must talk about the segregative effects of charter schools and of choice. And it's not just charters. Magnets are problematic in many ways too when they're selective enrollment. And I think there's another stand that the NAACP took this year. It didn't get as much press, I think, as the charter resolution last year. But there was a resolution this year, and I believe it has passed the national board. the chest, yes, that says that our schools are, including and especially charter schools, are not fulfilling the promise of Brown. Thank you.
So Betsy, you live in a city where well over 80% of the students in the local public school are kids of color. And your organization, ICP, my organization too, by disclosure, helps families move to various places throughout the region. And one of their main reasons for moving is related to schools. So given a school district where everybody's black or brown, right? How did we get there? And where can we go from there?
Well, how did we get to to an all-black, predominantly minority school district? I think the history is there. It started with the de jure, certainly in the South, the de jure segregation, and then the history of efforts to desegregate while we were chasing white people who were being encouraged and enabled to move, rather to flight rather than stay and try to fight to make the schools better. That history is something that we all know. So in terms of how we got there, I think it is important to understand these structures, because I think when you started, you quoted David, and I think I'd go back to it. Laws and public policy, I mean, we probably can't, I mean, can change hearts and minds with those policies, but we can change conduct and can change institutions, and that goes for schools. Everything from how you draw your attendance zones, and it's not just how you draw, for example, schools' attendance zones to send certain kids to certain schools, but it also affects the community, how they get drawn, what message it sends. Do we think it's a good thing to have our children living and going to school in racially and economically diverse and integrated environments, or do we think it's something the children need to be somehow protected from? So therefore, we can't officially segregate anymore, but we can use our tools like student attendance zones, and frankly, the alternatives. I think the previous discussion was really important. What do you offer alternatives that continue to reinforce this notion that that there are other things better than a diverse public school where everybody is going to school together? And I think that can be a downside. I certainly know all the upsides that I've heard from people who are really trying to provide really good educational situations for a wide range of kids, and particularly in an urban environment like Dallas. But the downside of that is the message that's perhaps sends to the public school concept that it somehow isn't, it can't deliver the positive experience that a specific, even a magnet school. Again, there are all kinds of good reasons to look at these alternatives and provide families with choice. They've only got one kid, and they're probably going to be out of school before we solve this problem. So you're trying to have those conversations on an individual basis. Changing hearts and minds there is very difficult. But institutionally, I do think if we focus on the harms of segregation, as we've talked about today, then it leads us to, whether it's in schools or housing, and Demetria refers to our program that works with families who want, very often what's motivating our families who are low-income moms with kids by and large is a desire to get their kids today in a better school as it relates to the scores, the tests, the resources that appear to be available. And it's hard to argue with those parents when they are sitting there saying, my child, I want the very best, and right now it looks like I can't get that here in this Dallas environment. And that may be true in that specific school that they're supposed to go to. So I don't think you argue with individual parents about their choices. I think we have to argue with ourselves as a society as to what are we going to come back to a belief that I think we did have once in the value of public education as a societal norm, an institution that supports the other values that our society holds. holds dear. But I do think that I know that one of the things that we were supposed to, or are supposed to talk about is today, now that we've laid out all of our barriers, all of our history of how we get here, is what we do to address it, and I think that's the harder question.
What are some of those barriers to the families who are trying to move to other types of neighborhoods?
Well, if you're really low income, the barriers are that you can't. The big one is that you can't find affordable housing oftentimes where all the other resources are. Bottom line, simple, straightforward, and certainly that's true in the Dallas metropolitan area. The maps all show it, and so while I was very interested in, I think, and David's point about the fact that there were all these accessible multifamily units at Section 8 rents in the Philadelphia area, that's not true in Dallas. And there are if you have a voucher, which theoretically makes you not housing poor, you may be otherwise at 30% of area median, but you've got a resource supposed to give you access to communities that are more economically diverse. But voucher discrimination against voucher holders in our area and in Texas. Voucher discrimination against voucher holders, particularly where the voucher population is predominantly black and or predominantly minority, is rampant in white areas. That is a game changer for families who have this precious voucher. I call it a bait and switch. You give them a voucher and then you say you can't use it anywhere but at the same high poverty, racially segregated neighborhoods you've always been sent to, and that's public policy that makes that happen, plain and simple. We've sued HUD to get the rents up so that the voucher can access the higher rent areas, and then they still won't take the voucher, even when the voucher is exactly equivalent to the rent that a market person pays. So that's one big current voucher. The location of affordable housing is other issues about lack of affordability, but I think that's one of the biggest barriers that our families certainly face, and they're all public policy barriers. We do not get to the hearts and minds problem at this point. If we could remove some of those institutional and legal barriers that are put in place by public policy, then perhaps the hearts and minds issue could be more effectively addressed.
Public policy, local, state, federal?
All of the above, all of the above. The local jurisdictions, local jurisdictions can or cannot adopt in many places ordinances prohibiting voucher discrimination. The state of Texas now realize we're not in California, we're sort of the opposite end of the spectrum. But the Texas legislature passed a law specifically prohibiting cities like Dallas and Houston and the bigger metropolitan areas that know this is a problem, prohibiting them from adopting ordinances. They call them source of income ordinances, but they're really voucher ordinances, prohibiting those local jurisdictions and the local control that those jurisdictions might like to exercise to address this issue from adopting ordinances that would require landlords to take vouchers if from a voucher holder that's otherwise eligible to pay the rent. So that's just and then of course the federal government, HUD's this is Ed Brooks' statement during the debate around the public adoption of the Fair Housing Act. Federal government's role in segregation is so well documented, so overwhelming and so pervasive and so ongoing that there's no, we don't need to revisit it. The question is, what do we do about it? And I think the working groups, the committees we're going to talk about at the end of the 2 days answer that question.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I just wanted to bring up the idea that it seems to me that the voucher market strategy to solving the problems of education and housing for poor people was grossly mistaken. It seems if a public school is crumbling in a neighborhood and we're going to give vouchers to the community.
No, you're talking about housing vouchers or school vouchers?
Either one. It really doesn't matter. And then we're going to expect to help everybody. Well, it's clearly clear that those vouchers can't possibly help everybody. Only a small percentage of those people will be able to take advantage of those vouchers. So the question for me is, what will vouchers do in a condition of pervasive segregation, which is what we've already established? And I'm suggesting that vouchers were not going to do a damn thing to address the pervasive segregation issue. And I I feel black parents have been sold a bill of goods saying, choice, 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 when you have no choice.
I think Chile is a good example of this. It's a mature voucher market, and that's exactly what you see. What's interesting is I don't know a lot about housing, but when I heard the gentleman talking about what happened with housing and the concentration that occurred with housing, that's exactly what happens with vouchers, is that the students actually become more concentrated by SES. There are a few students that are allowed into more higher academically achieving schools, but in a voucher market, what happens is the schools do the choosing. So school choice becomes exactly that. Schools do the choosing. So in Chile, what happened is they put in place, they made the schools more expensive, so you had to have an add-on, which is the same, sounds like the same as housing. And then the other thing that they did was they would allow small numbers of students in that had higher test scores, but what it essentially happened is that in the poor neighborhoods, you had higher concentrations of poor students, and the wealthy schools continued to do just fine. Can I talk really quickly about the role of labor? And are we?
And as you talk, can you please identify for us some of the actors who are problematic in some of the issues you bring out?
So the thing is that the folks that are have really retrograded this argument about civil rights and equity onto these neoliberal market-based approaches, because that's really what's happened. When Milton Friedman came up with these ideas, it was all about privatization. But you have this cabal of people who really truly believe that vouchers and charters are about civil rights and equity and access. And what they've done is they've created this motley alliance with folks who are interested in privatization and profit, right? And so that's been the real challenge. Well, that cabal is organized by a set of industrialists, whether they be the Gates, the Walton Family Foundation, the Koch brothers, and so in the courts, you see this concerted attack on working people. In the Janus case, you saw it on teachers in the Vergara case in California. And so they're well-funded and well-organized. I'm from, I grew up in Michigan, so I'm a Detroit Lions fan, Detroit Tigers fan. So I'm used to being the underdog. And in this conversation, we are really the underdog. Because the other side of this conversation on privatization and profit is very well funded. So, but we have the people power. We have this alliance of the faith community, of civil rights organizations, of the unions. We have to hearken back to those roots because especially with Janus, the unions are expecting 30 to 40% of their dues to evaporate because of the Janus case. And they don't believe that they're not optimistic that they'll be able to keep those. So I think what we really have to focus on is how this classic alliance can get involved with community-based reform instead of this reform that's external, that's top-down, that's about privatization, and it's about profit. We have to think about how we as communities implement solutions such as community schools, community-based teachers evaluations, locally based accountability, and locally based school finance. So I think that's where we have to go because there's a lot of questions about what's next. And there's very few people talking about what's next because the old political adage is you can't fight something with nothing. And so we have to talk about, A, the alliances that we need to have again and need to reverberate across our communities, and we need to be focused on how we do this reform in community-based ways because that cabal of industrialists is very organized and very well-funded.
So I know Betsy wants to say something, but let me ask you this as you prepare to talk, Betsy. Say a little bit from your perspective about, because it seems like there's a conversation going on that there's a de minimis value to choice or vouchers or what have you, housing vouchers, et cetera. Say a little bit about what you saw happen once you mentioned earlier that you guys got HUD to increase the value of the voucher so that they could access other neighborhoods. And there was within the first 3 years of the value of that voucher going up, how did the people who were voucher holders react?
Well, the Housing Authority estimated about 5,000 families were as a result of that. And it was increasing the value, it was making it truly a market value because what HUD did was suppress the value to make the rent so low that the only housing they that our voucher holder families could access were the lowest opportunity areas. So it was not that we increased it artificially, we just made it actually a fair market rent. The families took advantage of it and moved. And so there were like 5,000 families that moved from a very high poverty area into a higher opportunity areas. It varied across but they took it. They took that and ran with it. I understand the whole voucher versus public. I've been in this argument for a long time, or the discussion for 45 years around public housing starting. And I have definitely, the voucher program is a huge program. It is the way we have chosen and it was a Republican program, and it is market-driven. But that is for many of our families, while we are figuring this out, and the social justice movement has not figured this out for all this time, I always say, if you're a mom with a 6-year-old kid who's getting ready to start first grade, and they don't want to sign on for a social movement, they want to get their kid into a good school, I'm not going to tell them they can't do that, because in that situation, and not going to try to help them to do that. That doesn't mean I think that's the solution. That is the problem. That's the situation they're dealing with right there. And what Dimitri refers to, it wasn't just since for 30 years, every time we have moved barriers to voucher holders being able to get out of overwhelmingly segregated, high poverty areas, which is where, when we filed our lawsuit in 1985 in Dallas around the segregation of the voucher program, all the voucher holders lived in one zip code, and it was in the southern sector, and it was one zip code, and they were living in terrible housing conditions because that's the way the program worked. And over time, the program has been improved and pushing always on these barriers that exclude people from the kind of neighborhoods that most of us live in. And every time those barriers have been removed a little bit, families choose to go. Not everybody, it's not for everybody, but the families who have a voucher that want to go take advantage of it at a greater clip than we usually have housing opportunities for them to access, which comes back to the point at the first question, what's the biggest barrier? Lack of affordable housing everywhere. Mixed income housing throughout a region changes the dynamic all the way across the board for every community. So I think but I don't think there's a silver bullet, and I certainly don't think it's one size fits all. I do want to say, in terms of deciding what do we do what kinds of things, what kind of barriers do we remove? What kind of put in place by institutes and laws? Who benefits from segregation? Just ask that question every time, and every time you look at an institution, at an entity, at an industry, at a group of people, whether it be whoever it is, including the philanthropic community, who benefits and how do they benefit from segregation? Look and see what structures and what rules and what policies cause them to benefit from segregation. I look socially, economically, and institutionally. If you look at housing, it's easy to see. The banks, the developers, the syndicators, the lawyers, there's a host of folks who feed off of housing policy that benefit from the segregation that exists. Now, they benefit because that's the status quo, that's their business model, and for them to change that is very hard. Even if their hearts and minds are changed, they can't get their heads around the notion that they could operate in an integrated environment, because segregation's all they know as a business model environment, and that's who makes money off of segregation. So you've got to look and see how do they do it, but you also have to understand that when they step up, whether it's in Congress or at the local level, and advocate for a policy, you have to say, you're advocating for a policy that perpetuates segregation. Why? Is it because your heart and mind is in a bad place, or is it just because your pocketbook's in a bad place? Look at corporations, look at social media, and then look at the other institutions. Labor unions don't benefit from segregation. Everybody knows the history of race and labor going back forever, if you've ever looked at that. But today, labor does not benefit from segregation. So there's no real reason you're not going to. The labor movement is truly a progressive movement in this sense. But I think if people argue about that, just say what benefit does segregation give a labor union? What benefits does segregation give a labor force of people who are working particularly at the level of jobs that the labor union movement is most vibrant in? Who in public education benefits from segregation? Teachers don't benefit from segregation. They don't benefit from having to teach in struggling or failing schools. They don't benefit from segregation. So they're not the problem, I would just argue. And so I think that if you follow the money and look and see what industries, what public and private institutions benefit from segregation either actively or passively, then it begins to help us understand where our work needs to be done.
One policy each that would be top of your list to change, one each. It could be federal, state, or local.
Wow. Well, for me, it would be the requirement that we have high-stakes testing for all kids. We know that 100 years ago, tests came about to sort societies. That was the goal of those tests. Now, it's one of these things where it's been hidden. We've retrograded this new idea that somehow if we test a bunch of kids that we're going to create more equity. That hasn't happened. That didn't happen with No Child Left Behind. I think that tests have value for informational purposes, but the current tests that we have right now are not specific enough for them to be valuable to educators. I don't know if policymakers have told you that. But if you ask the average educator, they'll say, I look at it at the beginning of the year, maybe the end of the year. It's the locally based assessment that's a lot more valuable for educators. And then you can there's almost a direct correlation between the percent passing particular exams and the percent at-risk kids. And when I say correlation, for those of you that are statistical, we really mean correlation. Because it's at-risk, percent at risk is such a powerful predictor of that. So I think that, whether it was NCLB or ESSA, the component that requires testing of kids in a high-stakes manner, I think that has done a lot to sort African American and Latino kids in ways that are problematic for our society.
Bruce.
Okay, I guess I'm going to have to refer back to Dr. King, and one of his most memorable statements that I've always used in my classroom is his statement that segregation is a cancer in the body politic that must be removed before our democratic health can be realized. And with that being said, it seems to me that the most important public policy that we need to have is a federal housing policy. Because right now, a non-racialized federal housing policy housing policy is at the root to segregation, and that is the root to health issues, education issues, and a vast number of other systemic issues related to race. So I believe that it is paramount that affordable housing that is non-segregated be available for working people. And until that happens, I believe we will keep reproducing segregation and the effects of it.
I agree. It's a variation on that theme. I think that I would mandate, call it fair share or whatever. Nationally, I think that we ought to have a federal policy that says every community, every political jurisdiction, and we can talk about how that looks, has some affordable housing at every income level. I think that's important, number one, just practically. It would create a huge inventory. And that means not just voucher hold, but vouchers can access it. If people have got vouchers, we're not going to phase that program out tomorrow. But I'm talking about affordable housing by however you get there. Every community has to be able to house a certain number of people at 10%, 30%, 50%, and on up the line. And if you can't do that, that's a policy. And I think the second benefit of that, and it's a little bit more of a hearts and minds changer, because the first one's just, the institutional changer. I think we destigmatize, which we have done. We have stigmatized people. When I said it, the other thing in saying it's a bait and Section 8's a bait and switch, it also, our families, when they get a voucher, all of a sudden they have like a scarlet 8 on their chest. When they walk in, they're no longer a person. They're no longer a family. Even if they're a poor family, they are a Section 8 family, and we have let that happen by the way we act about people who get subsidy or get any kind of help. We have just put this stamp on them that says you are less. I think we've got to assume responsibility for the way we've done that and destigmatize being poor and destigmatize the racialized poverty that we have put in place. And I think one very broad way to do that is to ensure that every community has affordable housing, so you don't You don't stigmatize anybody, either community-wise, if that's their attitudes, and you certainly don't, we destigmatize the families that we have stigmatized.
All right, well, you heard from David Rusk in the beginning about post-World War II structures and policies. You've heard about today's structure and policies. So there are things to be done. There are actors to be contended with, from philanthropy to business, the market, to local and state legislative decision makers. So there's work to be done, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, panel. So I have the distinct pleasure to introduce Derek Johnson. I first met Derek virtually maybe 3 years ago. We were talking about education on the phone, and I thought to myself when I spoke to him, this brother knows what he's talking about. And so then I got to meet him in different NAACP events, and when he was named the president and CEO of NAACP, I was blown away because I think what you've seen over the last few months is a new era of NAACP voice. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Derek Johnson, President and CEO of the NAACP.
So thank you, Julian, and I want to thank the law school for inviting me. Julian said earlier that he's traveled over 100,000 miles this year. I feel like I've traveled over 100,000 miles in 3 days. Having flown this morning from DC to go to Detroit to be with the UAW, a group of pastors, to talk about expanding the Motown Museum, to get here today. But the topic here is one that I enjoy talking about. It is the root of by which NAACP exists. But being a Detroit native, residing in Mississippi, it is a real unique nexus of perspective I bring to the conversation. You grow up in Detroit, you're labor-fed and labor-bred. Somebody, if not everybody in your house, worked for a union somewhere. It's just the nature of the reality of that black migration and that Kentucky migration to Detroit because there were good jobs. If you live and work in Mississippi, you have a deep appreciation for the civil rights movement. And if you open yourself up to really immerse into the history of the civil rights movement, you understand the strategies and the way in which black resistance took place to have a quality of life. And so this conference is a good opportunity for me to share with you some of my perspective of why segregation exists, but more importantly, how we bend the arc, how do we move forward. Much of what I'm going to talk about will come from a very historical perspective, but it should be relatable today. And I always start with the question of why is there even a need for a civil rights movement? Why is there this separation between worker rights and civil rights, and who separated? Because there would have never been a need for a civil rights movement if people were not being exploited for free and cheap labor. The root of it all is about money, exploiting people to maximize profit. And everything else germinates from that, whether it's housing policy, education policy, access to voting, is all about this thing of profit. Connected to that is the tension of this nation, is a tension between democracy and capital. That being a capitalistic society has nothing to do with being a democratic society. And being a democratic society oftentimes threatens capital. And that tension exists because when democracy is strong, it keeps capital in check, and when capital is in check, people are not exploited. But when democracy is weak, capital have a freer hand to develop policy to exploit people for free and cheap labor. And so that's the tension that we wrestle with in all of the policy and the legal construct that surround it, either support one or the other. And oftentimes the outcome is thought of and then the rationale backs it up. You know, one of the things I learned in law school was that the law is fluid, it's not stagnant. And it's based on whatever interest is at the table at that time. And far too often, the interest that's sitting at the table is a part of the capital class. And because of that, we have different systems of structural racism that we still deal with today. And so the funny thing about growing up in Detroit and being an activist in Mississippi, it gives that perspective that's a lot different than most people, because we will go deep down into a particular issue and say that is the sum total of the fight. If we just win this housing policy fight, everything goes away. If we just win this education battle and have better schools, we're going to fix society. When truth be told, it's all of that and none of that at the same time. The real fight is, how do we make democracy work so that voices can be heard in the way that the need and interest of the communities that's going to be impacted by democracy are met. And so I'll start with the question of the franchise, because it's the question of the franchise that really would drive the policy conversation. But it's also the question of the suppression of the franchise, which has allowed what we see exists today. What's the solution? 3 years ago, there was a lot of fight around Shelby decision, the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, oh Lord, the ceiling has fallen, we gotta fix it. I'll take the premise that it was too limiting to start with. That we really need to be talking about how do we expand democracy? How do we look at models that have proven to work, such as compulsory voting? Australia style and what 200 countries exercise today, where it is a requirement to vote in addition to a right. How do we really look at access to voting in a way in which we don't limit voting in most states to 12 hours during a work day? Or voting in a way in which you get off work and you drive past 3, 4, 5 polling places because you have to vote only at this restrictive polling place. Why do we even have voter registration? Isn't that vote suppression within itself? Why should I, as a citizen, fill out an application to be approved to cast a ballot and then go within that work week, pass by all these polling places to cast a ballot? Why? Because of that tension between making democracy work and capital. There's no need for voter registration, especially if you want to require me to show my identification. If I can vote early at a courthouse and the technology know exactly where my precinct or my political boundaries are located so I know which ballot I should receive, why shouldn't precincts be able to do that on election day? Why isn't voting a holiday, or why don't we vote on Saturday? And if compulsory voting can work in over 200 countries, why couldn't it work in the United States? The issue here is about controlling labor, controlling profit. And if you can control access to voting, you can limit it, or you make it more difficult. Those who most need the protection of a legal construct that can enhance their quality of life, that can give them also social mobility, those individuals are less likely to navigate the process than individuals who are high wealth with more education. And so that's the tension we constantly find ourselves in. And so the struggle around that tension have always fallen in two primary approaches. Three, mostly two. Right? We talk about Martin Luther King. We have not talked much about the SNCC activists. And when you look at the two, one is based on an egocentric approach, and the other one is based on a community-centric approach. And an egocentric approach means that the movement is vested in a personality, a charismatic leader, the best speaker. And when that person is taken off the scene, people are disempowered because they're waiting for the next speaker, charismatic leader. A community-centric approach is one in which everyone sees their value in the movement for social justice. And a beautiful thing that Ella Baker created when she stepped out of the NAACP, because it was a bunch of male chauvinists sitting around the table. She recognized that there was an opportunity to do something different. Now, you had wonderful legal giants like Thurgood Marshall who did not believe that people should take to the streets. That could all be resolved in the courthouse. You had other individuals who felt that young people shouldn't be involved. You had some individuals who felt that it was a waste of time to do work in some of the southern states like a Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia, believe it or not.
I can see why.
You said you can see why?
I can understand it, yeah.
Yeah. It's dangerous, right? Yeah. And so we struggle with the notion of history and what direction to go, or how do we approach the current day reality. When I first took the position, people would say, well, the NAACP is getting old. What are you going to do about the young people? What about the movement for Black Lives? They normally say call it the Black Lives Movement, but the movement for Black Lives. Aren't you worried about young people no longer want to be a part of the NAACP? Are you concerned? What are you going to do about it? I said, I'm going to continue to celebrate them. Because young people adding their voices to the movement is a beautiful thing. And the most successful movements we've had is when young people and seasoned individuals create an intergenerational model that's community-centric around an outcome that can be measured over time with clear, decisive activity. That's when you get movements. Now, I've gotten in a lot of trouble using these two analogies. So I'm going to start with the old analogy. I'm going to use the newer analogy, and maybe I don't get in trouble when I use the new analogy. Selma was a failure. Some 53 years later, Selma was a failure. Now, the beautiful thing right here, none of y'all was involved in the March of Selma, so y'all not throwing bricks at me, saying, let's fill this brick, because I got hit with a brick when I was in Selma. All right? I say it was a failure, right? You had two marches across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You had John Lewis with his heroic activities. You had Bernard Lafayette, who really began to organize a lot of what's going on. You had Willie Ricks, who really was the person who pulled all that together. And Willie Ricks and John Lewis was a part of the group who had come from Mississippi with Freedom Summer, had organized that, and they determined that now that we understand the blacks can exercise the vote, we want to go to Alabama and see if we can control the vote. That's why the movement went from Mississippi to Alabama. 64, Freedom Summer, Alabama in 65, and then 66. And when they got over there, many of those student activists, most of those students came down or who lived in Mississippi was a result of Ella Baker putting together a conference. And at that conference, she allowed those young people to begin to strategize around how they can get engaged. Those young people were interested in getting engaged because of two primary factors. They had a professor who began to generate interest in the movement, and they were all around 13 years old when Emmett Till was killed. If you know any of the SNCC activists who are the original SNCC activists, when you talk to them, they say, what really ignited? He said, I was 12 years old, I was 13 years old, and I seen what happened on Twitter. They called it Jet Magazine back then.
Went viral.
And it went viral, that is correct. And those individuals who went to that meeting at Shaw College, now Shaw University, they began to strategize. And Chuck McDowell from South Carolina State was the first head of SNCC. But if you look at SNCC, majority of the students came from 5 HBCUs. They were students, a lot of schools, black and white, but mostly 5 HBCUs. Shaw College, Howard, Fisk, Morehouse, and Tougaloo. Majority of the schools, they came from those 5 schools. And when you talk to the SNCC activists who came from those 5 schools, you go a little deeper, it was a professor or administrator at those 5 schools who really began to plant the seed of this notion of democracy and how they should get involved. And those professors will plant those seeds in the way in which it was not simply about the process of getting involved, it was about the outcome of the involvement. So when they get to Alabama and they began to talk about the strategy, you had the individuals who stopped in Selma and they was deviating, they was talking about the process of getting involved. We got to go across this bridge, we got to do these things. And Karen Spellman and Carlin Cox and Stokely Carmichael and Hollis Walker say, we ain't getting hit upside the head no more. And they decided to go to the county over to Lowndes County. We had the marches in Selma. It received international press. It also went viral. And when everything was said and done, the mayor of Selma, Alabama, Smitherman, was still mayor in a 70% black town, and he remained mayor until 2000. If we're not materially impacting the lives of the communities that we purport to be demonstrating for, how can we count that as a success? Ferguson was a failure. Black men killed, young people got involved. It was outstanding. They democratized information like we had never seen before. Corporate media could no longer control the narrative. Instantly, we had young people who were talking about relevant stuff, and it was a place for everyone, whether you was in high school or college, whether you was in no school at all. There was a place for your voice to be heard. It was outstanding to see those young people get engaged. A year later, in that town of 67% African Americans, an election was held. And the political landscape of that city didn't change. It was the same mayor, same city council. But for a DOJ consent order, predatory policing will go back to same now, it's been lifted. And it's great to see activity and people involved in the process, but if we're not looking at the outcome, what difference will it make to the people who are most impacted? So community-centric organizing is outcome-driven organizing, but is based on the premise of making democracy work to keep capital in check. And if we don't do that, we will have this same conference 20 years from now talking about structural racism or segregation or however we want to brand it. You know, the wonderful thing when I was in law school, I didn't do well in law school. I went and I read a few books, and when I finished, I decided I don't ever want to see a courthouse a day in my life. But I had a wonderful constitutional law professor, and we were talking about Brown versus Board of Education, a tremendous decision. And he asked the class, he said, well, this is the 1954 decision. And it went back in 1955. And he said, all deliberate speed. Somebody tell me, what is all deliberate speed?
Whoa. Resistance.
Somebody said resistance, and we said slow. Anybody else? And we went through the whole classroom. And when he finished, he said, close your eyes. And let me paint a picture of all deliberate speed for you. It's like taking X-Lax with a sleeping pill. Let that marinate for a minute. What do you get? You get a mess. Let it marinate a little bit more. Huh? You get a mess. What have we had in the last 60 years of public education? A mess. It was a great decision. It opened up public accommodation. It opened up so much. But the very thing that we needed to do around education, we still have not been able to do. Why? Because the capital class need education to train the workforce. And you train the workforce based on the industry in that geography. So in many southern states, you have some of the worst education systems in the country because it's still, for the most part, based on an agricultural-based economy. They only need cheap labor. In other areas, you have a more thriving system. Why? Because you need to train a more high-tech workforce. And so what ended up happening over time, you sprinkle race and class in that gumbo, you get more profits. But education is the other cornerstone of making democracy work. Exercising the franchise is critical. Having critical thinkers to know how to navigate the process is essential. So if you don't have a base of critical thinkers who can look at a Donald Trump, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that, who can look at 45 and understand what he's saying and equate it to a snake oil salesman and not get pulled into the fear conversation that the social construct that we talk about, i.e. race, is all about. See, working poor whites and working middle income whites operate from a huge fear standard. And that fear standard is the realization that they were not white for very long. Most whites haven't been white for very long in this country. Because those who were not white, Anglo-Saxon Protestants, were not white. You only became white when it was politically expedient for you to become white because the WASP class was shrinking and they need more people to vote. Irish need not to apply. All of the bad Polish jokes, the racial epithets towards Italian, meaning the Jewish community could not be members of much up until the late 50s, 60s. You were not white. And so much of what's taking place is this fear that you may be declassified white real soon. So in this social construct to control profit, we have this current political landscape. Where do we go from here? You know, it's fascinating to watch the commentators over the last 2 days. It is great. Look at what the Democratic Party is doing. Virginia have stood up. They got all of the noise, all of the noise. What's really taking place is that the level of economic anxiety that was felt during last year's presidential election and the promise that something will be different has not been realized. And many of the individuals who are happy to be white now, but scared to be not called white again, realize that 45 is an embarrassment. And that the capital class have duped us once again by keeping us divided and creating this thing of otherness, is us against the otherness. African Americans and Latino recognize that we cannot rest on our laurels any longer, that we need to increase our participation. That women, although can at some point say we want to be progressive, but then go home and then vote against their interests last year, white women, I'm sorry, recognize that you have very little respect anyway. You know, I'll teach a class every so often at Tougaloo College, and I talk about how white women didn't have the right to vote before black men. And all of it is about this notion of white male supremacy in individuals who are not a part of that class, and the otherness, and that otherness are set up to be exploited for cheap or free labor or helpmates. How do we control the narrative to move forward? How do we get people to see beyond the limitations of fear? And the most wonderful thing about that most powerful emotion of fear, it has two reactions. It paralyzes you to do things against your interests, or it's a catalyst for you to do something moving forward. And I think that's our challenge. How do we use the fear as a catalyst to move forward? That's what those young people who were SNCC activists did. They were in fear because when they seen that Twitter alert and that picture of Emmett Till, they felt compelled to do something. But they also recognized they couldn't do it alone. And when Ella Baker, with some input from Byron Rushton, began to come up with the concept, and they run across Bob Moses, and he was sent to Mississippi. He was sent to World War II veterans who were strategists, MC Moore, Aaron Henry, who understood how to launch strategy. And through that intergenerational model, they sent him to C.C. Bryan. And then they created a movement of young people in the streets, and those World War II veterans providing support, protection, and direction towards an outcome in which they can advance the needle in a way that no one has seen before. Our challenge is, can we replicate the best in our society, young and old, black or white, around an outcome-driven strategy to make democracy work? By expanding the franchise and access to voting. So the needs and interests of the needy in our community can be heard because they can exercise it in the vote. So we can improve the quality of education to develop more critical thinkers to make society better for all. There's no single shot if we fix housing or education or this. It is all about how can we make democracy work together. Thank you.